The Frostwood in winter was a cathedral of ice and silence. Elarion had lived here for 73 years, a mere breath in the long life of an elf, but long enough to know every twisted pine, every frozen stream, every secret the forest whispered to those patient enough to listen. His cabin stood in a clearing where the ancient trees had decided, for reasons known only to themselves, to leave a space for the sky. On clear nights, that space filled with stars so bright they seemed close enough to pluck from the darkness like frost berries from a branch. Tonight was such a night. He sat on the worn wooden steps of his porch, a cup of pine needle tea cooling in his hands, and watched the constellations wheel overhead, the hunter, the stag, the wandering maiden. Stories his mother had told him centuries ago, when the world had seemed larger and more full of possibility. Now the world had contracted to this: the forest, the stars, the comfortable weight of solitude. Elarion didn't mind, or so he told himself. The ranger's life suited him. He rose before dawn to check his snares, though he took only what he needed, and often found himself releasing more than he kept. He spent his days walking the forest paths, reading the language written in tracks and scat, broken twigs and disturbed snow. A fox had passed here, a winter hare there. Once, memorably, a great elk with antlers like bare branches had crossed his trail, and they had regarded each other for a long moment before the elk had moved on, unafraid. The forest trusted him. He had earned that trust through decades of quiet respect. His cabin reflected his philosophy: simple, functional, beautiful in its utility. One room served as kitchen, workshop, and living space. A stone fireplace dominated the north wall, its mantel decorated with found objects: interesting stones, a hawk's feather, a piece of amber with an ancient insect preserved inside. His bed occupied the eastern corner, positioned so the first light of dawn would wake him naturally. Books lined makeshift shelves, field guides to flora and fauna, star charts, poetry collections he'd read so many times. The pages fell open to favorite verses without prompting. He owned 3 shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, 1 heavy cloak. His bow hung by the door, unstrung to preserve the wood. His arrows he'd fletched himself, each one straight and true. He needed nothing else. Or so he told himself. The tea had gone cold. Elarion stood, his joints protesting slightly. Even elves felt the winter chill in their bones, and went inside. The fire had burned down to embers. He added 2 logs, watching sparks spiral up the chimney like earthbound stars seeking their home in the sky. The wood was birch, which burned clean and bright. He'd cut it last spring, split it in summer, stacked it in autumn. The rhythm of seasons was the rhythm of his life. He prepared a simple dinner: bread he'd baked 3 days ago, cheese from the village 12 miles south, dried venison, an apple wrinkled, but still sweet. He ate slowly, tasting each bite, present in the moment. This was a meditation he'd learned long ago. Food was not merely fuel, but a gift from the forest and deserved gratitude. After dinner, he opened one of his books, a collection of poems by Thessalon the Wanderer, but found his attention drifting. The words, once vivid, seemed flat tonight. He read the same verse 3 times without absorbing its meaning. The heart that walks alone may claim it needs no home, but even stars in isolation sing silent songs of constellation. Elarion closed the book with more force than necessary. He was being foolish. He had everything he needed. The forest provided. The seasons turned. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. What more could an elf want? He banked the fire and went to bed, but sleep came slowly. Through the window he could see the stars, cold and distant and perfect. Beautiful things, stars, beautiful and utterly alone, each one separated from its neighbors by distances too vast to comprehend. He turned away from the window and eventually slept. Dawn came with the particular quality of light that only winter mornings possess, sharp, clear, unforgiving in its honesty. Elarion rose, dressed in the dark, and stepped outside into air so cold it made his lungs ache. His breath plumed white. Frost had painted intricate ferns across every surface overnight. He began his morning routine, checking the wards around his cabin. Simple spells to discourage predators, nothing fancy. Filling his water bucket from the stream, breaking through a thin skin of ice, preparing his pack for the day's patrol. He moved with the efficiency of long practice, each action flowing into the next. The forest was waking around him. A raven called from somewhere in the canopy. A squirrel chattered irritably, upset that someone had disturbed its territory. In the distance, a woodpecker drummed against a tree, the sound carrying clearly in the cold air. Elarion shouldered his pack, strung his bow, and set out. His route today would take him along the northern border of his territory, where the Frostwood grew dense and wild. Few people ventured there. The trees grew too close together, the shadows too deep. There were stories about the deep forest, old stories, the kind that had truth buried in their hearts. Elarion didn't dismiss such stories. He'd lived long enough to know that legends usually started with someone seeing something real. The snow was deep but crusted over, supporting his weight. He'd strapped on his snowshoes, which distributed his weight and let him move across the surface with minimal effort. His people had always been light of foot. It was part of being elven. But physics still applied. Deep snow required the right equipment. He walked for 2 hours, seeing the usual signs. Deer had passed through, browsing on low branches. A fox had hunted here, the tracks showing where it had pounced on some small creature beneath the snow. A family of winter hares had their warren nearby. He could see where they'd been digging for frozen grasses. All normal, all as it should be. Then he found the other tracks. They crossed his path in a small clearing where a fallen tree had created a gap in the canopy. Sunlight streamed down, making the snow sparkle like diamond dust. And there, perfectly preserved in that sparkling snow, were prints unlike anything Elarion had seen in 73 years of ranging. They were cloven hooves, like a deer's, but wrong, too small for one thing. A deer this size would be a fawn, but these tracks showed none of the wandering uncertainty of a young animal. They moved in a straight line, purposeful and sure, and they were too light. Even accounting for the crusted snow, these tracks barely depressed the surface. Whatever had made them weighed almost nothing, or was magic. Elarion knelt, removing his glove to touch the edge of one print. The snow there was warmer than it should be, not melted, but different, changed. He brought his fingers to his nose and inhaled. The scent was subtle but distinct. Moonflowers and starlight, if such things had a smell. Clean, pure, ancient. His heart began to beat faster. He was a ranger, not a scholar of magic, but he knew enough. He'd lived through the War of Shadows, had seen what dark sorcery could do. He'd also seen the other kind, the old magic, the wild magic, the kind that existed before elves or humans had tried to codify and control it. This felt like the latter. The tracks led north, deeper into the forest. Elarion stood, brushing snow from his knee. Every instinct told him to follow. This was something new, something unknown. In a life that had become perhaps too predictable, too settled, The unknown called to him like a half-remembered song. He adjusted his pack and followed the tracks. The forest grew darker as he went. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches interlocking overhead to block out the sky. Snow had fallen here, but not as heavily. The canopy caught most of it. The tracks were harder to follow, but Elarion had been reading signs since before some of these trees were saplings. He found a tuft of white fur on a branch, a place where the creature had paused to drink from a frozen stream, the ice showing the faintest impression of a muzzle. He was getting close. He could feel it. The forest had gone silent. No birds called, no squirrels chattered. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. This was the silence that preceded something significant. Elarion had learned to recognize it, to respect it. He moved more carefully now, placing each foot with deliberate precision, controlling his breathing, becoming part of the forest rather than an intruder within it. His bow remained unstrung. Whatever he was tracking, he had no intention of harming it. But his hand rested on the knife at his belt. Caution was not the same as fear. The tracks led to a clearing. Elarion stopped at the tree line, using the shadows for cover, and looked out at what lay before him. The clearing was circular, almost perfectly so, as if something had carved it deliberately from the forest. In the center stood a ring of standing stones, weathered and ancient, covered in frost and lichen. Elarion had never seen them before, though he thought he knew every inch of this forest. But the Frostwood was old and deep, and it kept secrets. And there, within the ring of stones, was the White Doe. She was the most beautiful creature Elarion had ever seen. Her coat was pure white, not the off-white of winter deer, but a white that seemed to glow with its own internal light. Her antlers, and yes, she had antlers, which was unusual for a doe, were silver, branching like frozen lightning. She stood perfectly still, her head raised, her dark eyes fixed on him. She had known he was there all along. For a long moment they regarded each other across the clearing. Elarion felt something shift in his chest, a sensation like ice cracking on a spring river. Those eyes. There was intelligence in those eyes, and sorrow, and something else he couldn't name. Then he saw the trap. It wasn't a physical trap. No steel jaws, no rope snare. It was worse. Around the doe's legs, barely visible against the snow, glowing runes formed a circle. They pulsed with a sickly purple light, and where they touched the snow had turned black. Dark magic, blood magic, the hunters of the Eclipse. Elarion's jaw tightened. He knew of them, though he'd hoped never to encounter their work. They were sorcerers who had turned from the natural order, who sought power through domination and sacrifice. They hunted magical creatures, harvesting their essence for dark rituals. The war had scattered them, but clearly some remained, and they had trapped this magnificent creature for their own purposes. The doe hadn't moved. She watched him still, and in her gaze, he read a question. Will you help me, or will you walk away? Elarion had never been good at walking away. He stepped into the clearing. The moment Elarion crossed the threshold of the clearing, the temperature dropped. Not gradually, but instantly, as if he'd stepped through an invisible wall into a pocket of deeper winter. His breath came out in thick clouds. Frost formed on his eyelashes. The runes around the White Doe flared brighter, sensing his presence. They began to pulse faster, their purple light casting strange shadows across the snow. Elarion could feel the magic now, pressing against his skin like oily water. It made him want to turn back, to leave this place and forget what he'd seen. That was part of the spell, a ward against interference. He pushed through it, gritting his teeth, and approached the ring of stones. Up close he could see that they were carved with symbols. Old symbols, predating even the elven kingdoms. This had been a sacred place once, a site of natural magic. The hunters had perverted it, twisted it to their purposes. The wrongness of it made his stomach turn. The doe remained motionless, but her ears swiveled toward him, tracking his movement. Her sides rose and fell with rapid breaths. She was afraid, he realized, not of him, of the trap, of what would happen if he failed. Easy, he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring her or himself. I'm going to help you, but you need to stay very still. He circled the trap slowly, studying it from every angle. The runes formed a perfect circle, each symbol connected to the next in an unbroken chain. That was the key to this kind of magic. The circle had to be complete to maintain its power. Break the circle, break the spell. But it wasn't that simple. These weren't simple binding runes. Woven between them were trigger glyphs, nasty little pieces of spell work designed to punish anyone who tried to interfere. He could see at least 3 different varieties. One would cause intense pain. Another would alert the casters that their trap had been disturbed. The third, he leaned closer, squinting at a particularly complex symbol. The third would transfer the binding to whoever broke the circle. Clever. Cruel, but clever. The hunters had ensured that any would-be rescuer would become trapped themselves, giving them 2 prizes instead of 1, and if the rescuer was an elf, a magical being, so much the better for their dark purposes. Elarion sat back on his heels, thinking. He could walk away, should walk away. This wasn't his fight. The hunters would come eventually, claim their prize, and he would be safe in his cabin drinking tea and reading poetry. The smart thing would be to leave. He looked at the doe. She was watching him with those impossibly deep eyes, and he saw that she knew exactly what he was thinking. She knew he was considering abandoning her, and there was no judgment in her gaze, only a profound sadness, as if she'd expected nothing else. That look decided him. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly. "But I need you to trust me. This is going to take some time." The doe blinked slowly. If he didn't know better, he'd say she understood every word. Elarion shrugged off his pack and began removing items. He'd need to be methodical about this. Rushing would trigger the traps. He'd learned patience long ago. It was the ranger's greatest tool, more valuable than any weapon. First, he took out a small leather pouch containing salt. Not regular salt, but salt he'd harvested from a sacred spring and blessed under the full moon. It wouldn't break the spell, but it might insulate him from the worst of the trigger glyphs. He poured a thin line of it in a circle around himself, creating a buffer zone. Next, he removed a silver needle, a gift from his mother, enchanted for mending. Not mending clothes, but mending magic. It was delicate work, the kind that required absolute precision. His mother had been a weaver of spells before the war. She'd taught him the basics before she'd passed into the West, seeking the peace that the mortal lands could no longer offer. He'd been young then, only 43. He'd thought he'd have more time with her. Elarion pushed the memory away. Focus. The doe needed him focused. He began to work. The trick wasn't to break the circle. That would trigger everything at once. The trick was to carefully unpick it, one thread at a time, unweaving the spell as gently as removing stitches from a wound. He started with the outermost rune, using the silver needle to tease apart the lines of power that formed it. It was like trying to untangle a knot in the dark. The magic resisted him, trying to maintain its structure. Sweat formed on his brow despite the cold. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly. One mistake and he'd be trapped alongside the doe, and then they'd both be at the hunter's mercy. Time lost meaning. The sun moved across the sky. though he didn't notice. His entire world contracted to the point of the needle, the glow of the runes, the careful work of dismantling dark magic with nothing but patience and will. The first rune collapsed. The circle flickered but held. There were 11 more to go. He moved to the second rune. This one was more complex. Its lines twisted back on themselves in a recursive pattern. He could feel the malice baked into it, the casual cruelty of whoever had crafted this trap. They'd enjoyed their work. That made it worse somehow. The doe shifted slightly, and Elarion looked up. "Don't move," he said softly. "Please. I know it's uncomfortable, but any movement might destabilize what I'm doing." She froze immediately, becoming so still she might have been carved from marble. Only her eyes moved, following his hands as he worked. "Thank you," he murmured, and returned to the spell. The second rune fell, then the third. The fourth took longer. It had a defensive subroutine woven into it, a nasty little surprise that sent a jolt of pain up his arm when he touched it. He gasped but didn't pull back. Instead, he pushed through, using the silver needle like a surgeon's scalpel to excise the infected magic. The sun was setting by the time he reached the 8th rune. The clearing had fallen into shadow, and the temperature had dropped even further. His fingers were numb, his back ached from hunching over, and his eyes burned from the strain. But he couldn't stop. Not now. The hunters might return at any moment. The 8th rune collapsed, the 9th, the 10th, 2 more. The 11th rune was the worst yet. It seemed to sense that its time was ending, and it fought him with everything it had. The purple light flared so bright it hurt to look at, the air filled with a high-pitched whine that made his teeth ache. The magic lashed out, trying to force him back, trying to make him give up. Elarion set his jaw and kept working. His mother's voice came to him across the years. "Magic is will made manifest, my son. The stronger will always prevails, and there is no will stronger than the will to protect something you love." Did he love this creature? He'd only just met her, but there was something about her, something ancient and pure and worth saving, and perhaps that was enough. The 11th rune shattered. One more. The final rune was the keystone, the one that held all the others together. It was also the most heavily trapped. Elarion could see at least 5 different trigger glyphs woven into it, each one more vicious than the last. This was the hunter's final defense, their guarantee that even if someone made it this far, they'd fail at the last moment. He studied it for a long time, looking for a weakness, a flaw, any way in that wouldn't set off the cascade of traps. There wasn't one. The hunters had been thorough. To break this rune, he'd have to trigger at least some of the traps. There was no way around it. Elarion looked at the doe. Full night had fallen now, and in the darkness her white coat seemed to glow with a soft radiance. Her eyes reflected the starlight, making them appear almost silver. "This is going to hurt," he told her. "Me, not you. But I need you to run the moment you're free. Don't wait for me. Don't look back. Just run. Do you understand?" The doe stared at him for a long moment. Then, deliberately, she shook her head. Elarion blinked. "Did you just... You understood me. You actually understood me." She nodded. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. This was no ordinary creature. He'd suspected as much, but having it confirmed was something else entirely. "You're not just a magical beast, are you? You're something more." Another nod. "And you won't leave me if I'm hurt." She stamped her hoof once, firmly. The meaning was clear. No. Despite everything, the danger, the pain waiting for him, the dark magic pressing in from all sides, Elarion smiled. "Stubborn, aren't you?" The doe's ears flicked forward. If he didn't know better, he'd say she looked amused. "All right then," he said. "We do this together, but you need to be ready. The moment I break this last rune, run. I'll be right behind you." It was a lie. He knew he'd be in no condition to run once the traps triggered, but he needed her to be ready to flee. One of them should escape this. He positioned the silver needle above the final rune, took a deep breath, and drove it down. The world exploded in purple light and pain. The first trap hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. The second set his nerves on fire, every inch of his skin screaming in agony. The third tried to bind him, magical chains wrapping around his arms and legs. He felt the spell trying to take hold, trying to trap him as it had trapped the doe. But he'd prepared for this. The circle of blessed salt flared white, pushing back against the binding magic. It wouldn't hold for long, but it didn't need to. He just needed a few seconds. With the last of his strength, Elarion twisted the needle and pulled. The final rune shattered. The circle broke. The spell collapsed in on itself with a sound like breaking glass. And suddenly the clearing was dark and silent and blessedly free of magic. The doe leaped forward, her hooves barely touching the ground. But she didn't run away. Instead, she came to him, lowering her head to nudge his shoulder where he'd collapsed in the snow. "Go," Elarion gasped. His vision was blurring, darkness creeping in at the edges. "Please, they'll come. You need to go." The doe made a sound, not quite a bleat, not quite a cry. It was a sound of distress and determination. She nudged him again, harder this time, trying to get him to stand. He couldn't. The traps had taken too much out of him. He could feel the dark magic still clinging to him, trying to finish what it had started. He needed rest, healing, time, none of which he had. "Stubborn," he murmured again, and the darkness took him. He woke to warmth. That was the first surprise. He should have been cold, frozen, probably dead. Instead, he was warm, almost comfortable. The second surprise was that he was moving. No, being moved, dragged through the snow. Elarion forced his eyes open. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and clear. He was on his back, being pulled by something. He turned his head, ignoring the spike of pain the movement caused, and saw the doe. She had his cloak in her teeth and was dragging him through the forest with surprising strength. Her white coat was luminous in the starlight, leaving a faint trail of silver radiance in her wake. She was glowing, actually glowing, with a soft light that pushed back the darkness. "You came back," he whispered. The doe's ear swiveled toward him, acknowledging that she'd heard, but she didn't stop. She kept pulling him, step by determined step, away from the clearing and the broken trap. Elarion wanted to tell her to leave him, that she'd be faster without his weight, but he couldn't find the words. The darkness was pulling at him again, trying to drag him back under. He fought it for a moment, then let it take him. If he was going to die, at least it would be knowing that he'd freed her. That was something. That was enough. When he woke again, he was in his cabin. The fire was burning. He was in his bed, covered with every blanket he owned. His pack sat by the door, along with his bow and his snowshoes. Everything he'd left in the clearing had been brought back, and curled up on the floor beside his bed, her white coat rising and falling with steady breaths, was the doe. She'd saved him, brought him home, stayed with him. Elarion reached down with a trembling hand and touched her head. Her fur was impossibly soft, warm despite the winter cold. She stirred at his touch, raising her head to look at him with those deep, knowing eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. She made a soft sound, almost a purr if deer could purr, and rested her head on the edge of his bed. Outside, the stars continued their eternal dance. But inside the cabin, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Elarion didn't feel alone. He fell back asleep with his hand resting on the doe's head, and his dreams were full of light. Elarion woke to sunlight streaming through his window and the smell of pine smoke. For a moment he lay still, trying to piece together what had happened. His body ached in ways he'd never experienced, a deep, bone-tired exhaustion that spoke of magical backlash. The memories came slowly, the trap, the runes, the pain of breaking the spell, and then darkness. He turned his head and saw her. The White Doe stood by the window, backlit by the morning sun, looking out at the forest. Her silver antlers caught the light and threw prismatic reflections across the cabin walls. She was so still she might have been part of the landscape, a sculpture of winter itself. But then her ear flicked, tracking some distant sound, and the illusion of stillness broke. She turned her head and met his gaze. "You're real," Elarion said, his voice rough from disuse. "I half convinced myself you were a fever dream." The doe walked to his bedside with steps so light they made no sound on the wooden floor. She lowered her head and nudged his hand gently, as if checking that he was indeed awake and whole. "How long?" he asked. She lifted one hoof, stamped once. "1 day?" He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain lanced through his chest and he gasped, falling back against the pillows. The doe made a distressed sound and pressed her nose against his shoulder. "I'm all right," he lied. "Just the magic. It takes a toll." He managed a weak smile. "You should see the other spell." She didn't look amused. If anything, her dark eyes held something like reproach. "You nearly died for me," they seemed to say. "That wasn't necessary." "It was absolutely necessary," Elarion countered, as if she'd spoken aloud. "Those hunters, they would have used you for something terrible. I couldn't let that happen." The doe held his gaze for a long moment, then deliberately lowered her head and touched her nose to his forehead. The gesture was so tender, so full of gratitude and something deeper, that Elarion felt his throat tighten. "You're welcome," he whispered. She stayed there for a moment, her breath warm against his skin, and Elarion felt something shift between them. A bond forming, not spoken, not even fully understood, but real nonetheless. Finally, she stepped back and moved to the door. She looked at him, then at the door, then back at him. "You want to leave?" He couldn't keep the disappointment from his voice. Of course she wanted to leave. She was a wild creature, a magical being. She didn't belong in a ranger's cabin. But she shook her head and stamped her hoof twice, then jerked her head toward the north. "North?" Elarion frowned. "You want to go north?" A nod. "Why?" She pawed at the floor, clearly frustrated by the limitations of nonverbal communication. Then she did something extraordinary. She walked to the fireplace where the ashes were still warm and carefully extended one hoof into the fine gray powder. Then, moving with deliberate precision, she began to draw. Elarion pulled himself up despite the pain, needing to see what she was creating. The image was crude but recognizable, a mountain peak, sharp and high, with something at the summit. The doe added more details, stars around the peak, and something large with wings. A dragon. "Dragon's Peak," Elarion breathed. "You want to go to Dragon's Peak?" An emphatic nod. That's at least a week's journey from here, through some of the most dangerous terrain in the Frostwood." He studied her drawing, his mind racing. "The old stories say there's a dragon sleeping there. The crystal dragon, the last of the ancient worms. But that's just a legend. No one's seen it in 1,000 years. The doe stamped her hoof insistently and pointed at the drawing with her nose. "You think it's real?" It wasn't a question. And you think, what? That it can help you somehow? Another nod, this one almost desperate. Elarion looked at her, really looked at her. The intelligence in her eyes, the way she moved with purpose and understanding, the magic that clung to her like morning mist. She wasn't just enchanted, she was trapped. The form of a doe was a prison, and she needed the dragon to break free. "You're cursed," he said quietly. "Someone cursed you into this form." The doe closed her eyes and nodded once, slowly. When she opened them again, they glistened with moisture. Tears. The white doe was crying. Something broke in Elarion's chest. He'd thought himself content with solitude, thought he'd armored his heart against attachment. But seeing her pain, understanding what she'd endured, it shattered every wall he'd built. "Then we go north," he said firmly. "As soon as I can walk without falling over, we go to Dragon's Peak, and we find your cure." The change in the doe was immediate. She raised her head, her whole body seeming to straighten with hope. She came to him again and pressed her forehead against his, and Elarion felt a pulse of warmth, magic, clean and pure, flowing from her into him. It wasn't much, but it eased some of the pain, dulled the ache in his bones. "Thank you," he murmured, "but save your strength. You'll need it for the journey." She pulled back, and if a doe could look stubborn, she managed it. Despite everything, Elarion laughed. All right, I accept your help, but I'm still resting for at least another day. We leave the day after tomorrow. Agreed?" She considered this, then nodded. "Good. Now, I don't suppose you know how to make breakfast?" The look she gave him was so perfectly exasperated that he laughed again, and it felt good. It felt like waking up after a long sleep. The next day passed in quiet preparation. Elarion's body recovered faster than he'd expected. The doe's magic had helped more than he'd realized. By afternoon he was able to move around the cabin without pain, though he tired easily. The doe watched everything he did with keen interest. When he began sorting through his supplies, deciding what to bring, she would occasionally nudge items toward him or push others away. She had opinions, apparently, about what they'd need. "The extra rope?" he asked, holding it up. A nod. "The copper pot?" She shook her head. "But I need it for cooking." She fixed him with a look that clearly said, "We'll figure it out. It's too heavy." She was right, of course. Every ounce would matter on a journey this long. Elarion put the pot back. They worked together through the afternoon, and Elarion found himself talking to her constantly. At first, it felt strange. He'd lived alone for so long that speaking aloud was unusual, but she was such an attentive listener, her ears swiveling to catch every word, her eyes following his movements, that it began to feel natural. "I haven't been to Dragon's Peak since I was young," he told her as he sharpened his knife. "My father took me once, said every ranger should see it. The mountain is sacred to my people. We believe it's where the first elves learned magic from the dragons." He tested the blade's edge against his thumb. Of course, that was before the war, before the dragons left. Now it's just another mountain with another abandoned legend at its peak. The doe made a soft sound of disagreement. "You really think the crystal dragon is still there?" She nodded firmly. "Well, I suppose we'll find out." He set the knife aside and picked up his bow, checking the string for wear. "If it is there, and if it's willing to help you, what happens then? You transform back into your true form?" She nodded again, but there was something wistful in her expression. "What were you?" he asked softly. "Before the curse, what form did you wear?" She looked away, toward the window and the forest beyond. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she walked to the ashes again and began to draw. The figure she sketched was unmistakably elven, slender, graceful, with long hair and the pointed ears of their kind. She added details: a circlet on the head, stars around the figure, flowing robes. "You're an elf," Elarion breathed. "A highborn elf, by the looks of it. Nobility." A nod. "How long have you been cursed?" She drew a circle, then divided it into segments. One full circle, then another, then a third, and a fourth. 4 years? He felt sick. "You've been trapped like this for 4 years?" She nodded slowly, and there was such sorrow in the gesture that Elarion had to look away. 4 years as an animal, unable to speak, unable to even hold the form that was rightfully hers. The cruelty of it was staggering. "Who did this to you?" She stamped her hoof angrily and drew a symbol in the ashes, a circle with a slash through it, half black, half white. An eclipse. The hunters, of course. It all made sense now. They cursed you, then set a trap to capture you. They probably planned to use you in some ritual, drain your magic slowly over years. His hands clenched into fists. "We destroyed their trap, but they won't give up. They'll come looking for you." The doe met his eyes steadily, and he saw that she knew. She'd always known. But she also wasn't afraid, or rather, she was afraid. But she'd decided that the risk was worth taking. She would go to Dragon's Peak or die trying. "Then we'd better not let them find us," Elarion said. "We'll move fast, stick to the hidden paths. I know routes that haven't been traveled in decades. If we're careful and lucky, we'll reach the mountain before they even know we've left." She stepped close and rested her head against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her neck, careful of the silver antlers. Her fur was warm and impossibly soft, and he could feel her heartbeat, quick and strong. "We'll break this curse," he promised. "I don't know how, but we will. You're not alone anymore." She made a soft sound, almost a sigh, and he held her tighter. Outside the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. Tomorrow they would begin a journey into the unknown, chasing a legend that might not even exist. It was foolish. It was dangerous. It was the most alive Elarion had felt in 73 years. They left at dawn. The cabin looked small and lonely as Elarion locked the door, a symbolic gesture since anyone determined enough could break in. But it felt important. This place had been his refuge for decades. Leaving it felt like leaving a part of himself behind. But when he turned and saw the doe waiting for him, patient and trusting, he knew he was making the right choice. Some things were worth leaving home for. His pack was carefully balanced, loaded with essentials: dried food, water skins, medical supplies, rope, fire-starting materials, his bedroll. He'd strapped on his snowshoes and carried his bow and quiver. The doe carried nothing. She didn't need to. Her magic would sustain her in ways his supplies sustained him. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded and took a step north. They walked side by side into the forest, their breath pluming white in the cold air. The sun was just rising, turning the snow to gold, and for a moment, everything was perfect and still. Then the forest came alive around them, birds calling, branches creaking, the soft whisper of wind through pine needles. The journey had begun. For the first few hours, they traveled in comfortable silence. Elarion led them along a hunter's path he knew, one that wound between the oldest trees and avoided the more traveled routes. The doe followed with an easy grace that made his own movements seem clumsy in comparison. She flowed over obstacles like water, her hooves barely disturbing the snow. "Show off," he muttered, when she leaped a fallen log he'd had to climb over. She looked back at him, and he could swear she was smirking. By midday, they'd covered good ground. Elarion called a halt in a small clearing where a frozen stream cut through the forest. He broke through the ice to refill his water skins while the doe browsed on some winter-hardy shrubs. She ate delicately, selecting specific leaves and rejecting others. There was nothing animal about it. She chose her food with the discrimination of someone at a formal dinner. "Do you miss it?" Elarion asked as he chewed on a piece of dried venison. "Real food, I mean, the kind you eat with hands and forks?" The look she gave him was answer enough. "Sorry, stupid question." He offered her a piece of his travel bread. "Can you eat this or—" She sniffed it, then took it gently from his hand and managed to consume it despite lacking the teeth designed for bread. She chewed thoughtfully, then nodded approval. "Better than shrubs?" A definite nod. He laughed and gave her another piece. "Don't worry. When we break this curse, I'll take you to the finest tavern in the realm. You can have whatever you want. Roast duck, honey cakes, wine from the southern vineyards. My treat." She tilted her head, and her eyes seemed to ask, "Is that a promise?" "It's a promise," he said solemnly. She stamped her hoof once, a gesture he was learning meant agreement or satisfaction, and returned to her browsing. They rested for half an hour, then continued north. The forest was changing around them, the trees growing taller and more ancient, the snow deeper. They were entering the true Frostwood now, the deep places where few people ventured. Elarion felt the weight of centuries pressing in, the accumulated magic of ages settling over them like a cloak. This was old forest, the kind that remembered when dragons flew overhead and elves were young as a race. It was beautiful and terrible, and demanded respect. The doe seemed more at ease here, as if she recognized something familiar. Her step was lighter, her head held higher. This was closer to her world than his cabin had been. As the sun began to set, Elarion started looking for a place to camp. They needed shelter. The temperature would drop severely once night fell, and while his magic could sustain him to some degree, he was still vulnerable to the cold. The doe suddenly stopped, her ears swiveling forward. She'd heard something. Elarion froze, his hand going to his bow. "What is it?" She didn't respond, just stared into the trees ahead. Then slowly she began to walk in that direction. "Wait." But she was already moving, and he had no choice but to follow. She led him off the path through a dense thicket that required him to push through branches while she slipped through effortlessly. He was about to complain when he emerged into a small hollow, and the words died on his lips. It was perfect. A natural shelter formed by 3 massive boulders leaning against each other, creating a cave-like space underneath. The entrance faced south, away from the worst winds. Inside would be dry and relatively warm, and best of all, there was evidence that someone had used it before. A ring of stones for a fire, some dried wood stacked neatly in the corner. "How did you know this was here?" Elarion asked in wonder. The doe just looked at him with those knowing eyes. "Right, magic. I keep forgetting you're not just a very clever deer." She snorted, and walked into the shelter to investigate. Elarion followed, shrugging off his pack with relief. His shoulders ached from the day's travel, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from meaningful effort. He set about making camp, clearing the fire ring, arranging wood, unrolling his bedroll. The doe watched for a moment, then curled up in the corner, her white coat glowing faintly in the dimming light. He got the fire going, a small one, just enough for warmth and light, and prepared a simple meal. The doe declined food, apparently satisfied with what she'd browsed earlier. Instead, she rested her head on her foreleg and watched the flames dance. "What was your name?" Elarion asked suddenly. "Before, I mean. When you were yourself." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw sadness flicker across her features. Then she rose and came to the fire, using her hoof to write in the dirt floor of the shelter. The letters were clumsy, but readable. Lyra. Lyra, he repeated softly. The name suited her, musical, elegant, full of light. It's beautiful. May I call you that? Or would you prefer I wait until you're restored? She considered, then stamped her hoof once. Yes, call me that. Lyra, he said again, testing how it felt on his tongue. I'm honored to meet you properly. My name is Elarion, but you probably figured that out from all my talking. She made a soft sound that might have been laughter. I know, I talk too much. Hazard of living alone for so long. When you finally get company, you can't shut up. He poked at the fire with a stick. You'll have to forgive me. I'm a bit out of practice with the whole traveling companion thing. Lyra moved closer and laid her head on his lap, the gesture now familiar and comforting. He stroked her fur, marveling again at its softness. We'll reach Dragon's Peak, he told her, and we'll find the crystal dragon, and we'll break this curse. I promise you, Lyra, I don't break my promises. She made a soft, contented sound and closed her eyes. Outside, the first stars were appearing, sharp and bright in the winter sky. Elarion leaned back against the stone wall, one hand resting on Lyra's head, and watched the fire burn down to embers. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But tonight, in this small shelter in the heart of the Frostwood, he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The storm came without warning on the third day. They'd been making good progress, following a ridgeline that offered clear views of the territory ahead. The sky had been cloudless when they set out that morning, the air crisp and cold, but manageable. Elarion should have known better. In the Frostwood, winter weather could turn in a heartbeat. The first indication was the wind. It picked up suddenly, swirling snow from the ground into small vortexes that danced around their feet. Then the temperature dropped, not gradually, but as if someone had opened a door to a colder world. Within minutes, the sky had darkened to a bruised purple gray, and snow began to fall. Not the gentle, picturesque snow of children's stories. This was a blizzard, with flakes as sharp as glass and wind that cut through layers of clothing like a knife. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The world became a whiteout of screaming wind and stinging ice. "We need shelter," Elarion shouted, but the wind tore the words from his mouth and scattered them into the void. Lyra pressed close to him, her white coat already accumulating snow. Even her magic couldn't protect her from this. She looked around desperately, her ears flat against her head, searching for any sign of refuge. There, Elarion spotted a dark shape through the snow. A rock formation, maybe a cave. It was their only chance. He grabbed onto Lyra's neck, using her as an anchor as much as guiding her, and they pushed forward through the storm. The wind fought them for every step. Elarion's snowshoes, which had been so useful before, now caught on hidden obstacles beneath the snow. He stumbled, nearly fell, but Lyra braced herself and kept him upright. They moved as one creature, supporting each other, refusing to let the storm separate them. The dark shape resolved into an overhang, a shelf of rock jutting out from a cliff face. It wasn't large, barely enough for both of them, but it would block the worst of the wind. They half crawled, half collapsed into the space, gasping for breath. The difference was immediate. The wind still howled and snow still blew in through the opening, but the rock wall at their backs blocked the worst of it. Elarion shrugged off his pack with numb fingers and assessed their situation. It wasn't good. The space was tiny, maybe 6 feet deep and 8 feet wide. The ceiling was so low he had to hunch. There was no way to make a fire. The wind would just blow it out, and they couldn't risk using up all their oxygen in such a confined space. They had shelter from the wind, but no source of heat, and it was cold, bone-achingly, dangerously cold. Elarion's hands were already losing feeling despite his gloves. His face hurt where the wind had scoured it. He could see his breath, thick as smoke, and each inhalation burned his lungs. Lyra was in better shape. Her magic provided some protection, but even she was shivering. Snow clung to her coat, melting and then refreezing, forming a layer of ice. "We need to stay warm," Elarion said, his teeth chattering. "Conserve heat. It's the only way we're getting through this." He pulled his bedroll from his pack and spread it on the ground, creating a barrier between them and the frozen earth. Then he wrapped his cloak around himself and sat with his back against the stone wall, drawing his knees to his chest. It helped, but not enough. The cold was insidious, creeping through every gap in his clothing, stealing warmth from his body faster than he could generate it. His fingers and toes were going numb. That was the first sign of serious trouble. If he didn't warm up soon, frostbite would set in. Lyra watched him with growing concern. She could see what was happening. He was losing the fight against the cold. She made a decision. Before Elarion could react, she moved closer, pressing her body against his side. Then, with careful deliberation, she lay down and rested her head on his lap, positioning herself so that her body heat could reach him. "Lyra, you don't have to," he started. But she fixed him with a look that clearly said, "Shut up and accept help." He shut up. The change was immediate. Lyra's body radiated warmth like a living furnace, far more heat than any normal deer should generate. Her magic, he realized. She was using her magic to keep them both warm, burning through her own reserves to save him. "Thank you," he whispered, and placed his hands on her neck, letting the warmth seep into his frozen fingers. They settled in to wait out the storm. Time became strange in the shelter, with no way to see the sun and the storm creating an unchanging twilight. Elarion lost track of whether it was day or night. The wind howled endlessly, sometimes rising to a shriek that hurt the ears, sometimes dropping to a moan that was somehow worse. Snow continued to blow in, accumulating in drifts at the shelter's entrance. Elarion's world contracted to the space they occupied. The warmth of Lyra's body, the sound of her breathing, the soft glow of her coat in the darkness. He kept his hands on her neck, both for warmth and for the comfort of contact. He wasn't alone. That mattered more than he wanted to admit. "Tell me about your life," he said, after what might have been hours. "Before the curse. What was it like?" Lyra shifted slightly, considering. Then she began to stamp her hoof in patterns, a makeshift code they'd developed over the past days. 1 stamp for yes, 2 for no, 3 for uncertain. But this was more complex. She was trying to tell a story. Elarion watched, interpreting. "You lived in a city, a grand city." She stamped once, yes. "You were important there, noble family." Again, yes. "You had duties, responsibilities." Yes, but you were unhappy. Lyra went still, and Elarion realized he'd struck something true. "You felt trapped," he said softly. "Even before the curse. The castle, the court, the expectations. They were another kind of prison, weren't they?" She made a sound, not quite a bleat, more like a sigh, and nodded her head. "I understand," Elarion said. "More than you might think. My family was important too in our community. Not nobles, but respected. My father was the chief ranger, and everyone expected me to follow in his footsteps perfectly. Be the exemplary son. Make the right choices. Serve the realm with honor." He stroked her fur, the repetitive motion soothing to them both. I did everything right for a long time, trained harder than anyone else, learned everything I could about the forest, about tracking, about survival. I was good at it, better than good. By the time I was 50, I was one of the youngest rangers to earn a full posting. He paused, remembering. And I was miserable, because none of it was for me. It was all for them, for my father, for the expectations, for this image of who I was supposed to be. Lyra turned her head to look up at him, her dark eyes reflecting what little light penetrated the shelter. Then the war of shadows came, Elarion continued, his voice dropping. Everything changed. The old structures broke down. People died. So many people. My father died in the 3rd year, leading a defense of the eastern watchtowers. He died a hero. He was quiet for a moment, lost in memories he usually kept locked away. After the war, I could have gone back to the cities. They were rebuilding, needed experienced rangers to help establish new territories. But I didn't. I went to the Frostwood instead, found that cabin, and just stayed. Told myself I was needed there, that someone had to watch the deep forest, but really? He laughed bitterly. I was hiding. From the memories, from the expectations, from the weight of being the hero's son. Lyra made a soft, sympathetic sound and pressed closer. 73 years I've been in that cabin, Elarion said. 73 years of telling myself I was content. That solitude was what I wanted, that I didn't need anyone else. He looked down at her, and his expression softened. Then you came along and broke that lie wide open. Because the moment I saw you in that trap, I knew. I knew I'd been lying to myself. Because I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Purpose. Connection. Fear of losing someone I'd just met. He bent down and rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the cold air. Thank you, he whispered, for dragging me out of that cabin, out of my comfortable prison. Whatever happens at Dragon's Peak, whether we break your curse or not, thank you for reminding me what it means to be alive. Lyra closed her eyes, and a single tear traced down her muzzle. Elarion wiped it away gently. We're quite a pair, aren't we? He said, trying to lighten the mood. 2 prisoners fleeing their cages, chasing a legend across a frozen wasteland. If we survive this, they'll write ballads. Terrible ballads with too many verses and questionable rhyme schemes. That got a response. Lyra's body shook slightly in what could only be laughter. The sound was strange coming from a deer, but it was genuine, and it made Elarion smile. That's better, he said. No more sad stories. Let me tell you a happy one instead. He told her about the Festival of Stars, an elven celebration held every autumn. He described the lanterns floating into the sky, carrying wishes and prayers to the heavens. The music that lasted all night. Flutes and harps and drums that made your feet move without conscious thought. The food tables groaning under the weight of harvest bounty. The dancing in the streets, young and old alike spinning and laughing until dawn. I haven't been to one in over 60 years, he admitted. Told myself they were too far away, too crowded, too much trouble. But the truth is, I was afraid of being around that much joy when I felt so empty inside. He stroked her neck. I'll go to the next one, I promise, and I'll take you with me. The real you. We'll dance until our feet hurt and eat until we can't move and watch the lanterns rise until the sky looks like it's full of earthbound stars. Lyra stamped her hoof enthusiastically. Yes, I want that. It's a date then, Elarion said, and felt warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with her magic. He told her other stories too. About the time he'd tracked a particularly clever fox for 3 days, only to discover it had been tracking him the whole time, curious about the strange elf in its territory. About the summer he'd befriended a family of ravens who'd learned to mimic his voice and used it to play pranks on him. About finding a grove of trees that sang when the wind blew through them in just the right way, creating harmonies that made him weep for the beauty of it. With each story, the shelter felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. The storm still raged outside, but inside, they'd created their own small world of warmth and words and connection. Elarion's voice grew hoarse from talking, so he fell silent, simply existing in the moment. Lyra's breathing had grown deep and regular, not quite sleep, but a meditative rest. Her magic still flowed, keeping them warm, but it felt less strained now, as if their emotional connection had somehow made it more efficient. He let his own eyes close, not sleeping but resting. His hand remained on Lyra's neck, feeling the steady pulse of her heartbeat. It was strange how quickly she'd become essential to him. 4 days ago, he'd been alone, convinced he needed no one. Now he couldn't imagine continuing without her presence beside him. Was this love? He wasn't sure. It felt different from anything he'd experienced before. Not the passionate fire of youth, but something deeper, more fundamental. Like recognizing a part of yourself in another being. Like finding the piece you didn't know was missing. "Lyra," he said softly. Not sure if she was still awake. She stirred slightly, acknowledging him. "When we break the curse, and we will break it, what happens then? You return to your life, your family, your responsibilities in the city." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she twisted her head to look at him directly, and there was something fierce in her gaze. She shook her head slowly, deliberately. "No. No?" Hope fluttered in his chest. "You don't want to go back?" Another headshake. "What do you want?" She couldn't answer with words, but her eyes said everything. "This. I want this. I want freedom. I want choice. I want to dance at festivals and see singing groves and maybe, possibly, hopefully, spend time with a certain ranger who talks too much and doesn't realize how rare he is." Elarion's breath caught. "Lyra, She pressed her nose against his hand, silencing him. "Not yet," the gesture said. "Wait until I can speak the words properly. Wait until I can tell you everything I'm feeling with my own voice, but know that I'm feeling it." He nodded, not trusting his voice, and pulled her closer. She came willingly, resting her head on his chest, over his heart. He wrapped his arms around her neck and held on as if she were the only solid thing in a shifting world. Outside, the storm began to ease. The wind's howl dropped to a whisper, then to silence. The snow stopped falling. Through the shelter's entrance, a shaft of pale sunlight penetrated, turning the accumulated snow to gold. The storm had passed. Neither of them moved immediately. They stayed in their embrace, reluctant to break the spell of intimacy the blizzard had forced upon them. But eventually, practical concerns reasserted themselves. They needed to move, to continue the journey before another storm caught them. Elarion stretched carefully, his muscles stiff from staying in one position for so long. His body ached, but he was alive and whole, with all his fingers and toes intact. That was more than he'd expected when the storm first hit. "Thank you," he said to Lyra, meaning it in every possible way. She stood and shook herself, snow flying from her coat in a glittering cloud. Then she moved to the entrance and looked out at the transformed landscape. The storm had reshaped everything. Drifts as tall as Elarion covered the areas that had been clear before. Trees bowed under the weight of new snow. The sky was a brilliant, almost painful blue, scrubbed clean by the wind. It was beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. "We need to be careful," Elarion said, coming to stand beside her. "That snow will be unstable. Avalanche risk will be high." Lyra nodded and took a careful step out of the shelter. Her hoof sank only a few inches, her magic again, lightening her enough to walk on top of the snow. Elarion would have to rely on his snowshoes and hope they were sufficient. They gathered their things and set out into the new-made world. The landscape was alien now, all familiar landmarks buried or transformed. But the mountain peak was still visible in the distance, sharp against the blue sky. Dragon's Peak, their destination, their hope. As they walked, Elarion found himself glancing at Lyra more often than the path ahead. The storm had changed something between them, brought them closer in ways that went beyond mere companionship. He'd held her through the coldest night, shared his deepest fears and regrets, and she'd done the same in her own way. They weren't just a ranger and a cursed elf anymore. They were partners, friends, and maybe, possibly, hopefully, something more. The sun climbed higher, and they walked on toward the mountain, leaving their shelter behind but carrying its lessons with them. Sometimes, Elarion thought, the harshest storms brought the greatest gifts. You just had to survive them first. The morning after the storm dawned clear and cold, the kind of cold that made the air itself seem brittle. Elarion and Lyra had made camp in a small depression surrounded by evergreens, their branches heavy with fresh snow. The world was silent in the way only a winter forest after a blizzard could be, a silence so complete it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Elarion woke first, as was his habit. He lay still for a moment, watching the pale light filter through the trees, listening to Lyra's steady breathing beside him. She'd curled up close to him again during the night, sharing warmth, and he'd grown accustomed to her presence. More than accustomed. He'd come to need it. He rose carefully, not wanting to wake her, and stepped out of their makeshift camp to survey the area. The snow sparkled in the early light, pristine and unmarked except for their tracks from the previous evening. The mountain loomed larger now, perhaps 2 days away if the weather held. They were making good progress. Then he saw the trees. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, shadows cast strangely by the rising sun. But as he looked closer, his blood ran cold. A line of evergreens, perhaps 50 yards from their camp, had turned black. Not burned, but corrupted. Their needles had withered and fallen, their bark had taken on an oily sheen, and the snow around their bases had darkened to the color of old bruises. Dark magic. Recent dark magic. Lyra, he called softly, urgently. She was beside him in an instant, sleep vanishing from her eyes as she took in the scene. Her ears went flat against her head, and a low sound of distress escaped her throat. Elarion approached the corrupted trees carefully, every sense alert. The wrongness intensified as he got closer, a feeling like oil on his skin, a taste like copper in his mouth. This was the same magic that had created the trap, but stronger, more focused. At the base of the nearest tree, he found tracks, boot prints, human-sized, leading from the north and circling their camp before heading back the way they'd come. Someone had been here during the night, watching them while they slept. The hunters, Elarion said, his voice tight. They found us. Lyra stamped her hoof in agitation, looking around as if expecting an attack at any moment. No, they're gone now, Elarion assured her, though his hand rested on his bow. These tracks are hours old. They were scouting, gathering information. He studied the pattern of prints. 3 of them, I think, maybe 4. They know where we are and where we're heading. He returned to their camp and began packing with swift efficiency. Every moment they remained in one place was a moment the hunters could use to prepare an ambush. They needed to move, needed to stay ahead of their pursuers. Lyra watched him work, her agitation evident in every line of her body. When he shouldered his pack, she moved close and pressed her forehead against his chest, a gesture that had become familiar, a request for reassurance. "I won't let them take you," Elarion said, placing his hand on her neck. "I swear it, Lyra. They'll have to go through me first." She pulled back and looked at him with those impossibly deep eyes, and he saw fear there. Yes, but also trust. She believed him. That trust was a weight and a gift in equal measure. They set out immediately, moving faster than before. Elarion pushed the pace, knowing that speed was now as important as caution. The hunters were behind them, but they had the advantage of knowing the terrain. If they could reach Dragon's Peak before the hunters caught up, they might find safety, or at least answers. As they traveled, Elarion found himself constantly scanning their surroundings, looking for signs of pursuit or ambush. The forest felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a hunting ground. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every sound could be a warning. Around midday, they stopped briefly to rest and eat. Elarion chewed mechanically on dried meat, his mind racing through possibilities and plans. The hunters wouldn't attack openly. They preferred traps and ambushes, striking from the shadows. But they also needed Lyra alive for their ritual, which meant they'd try to capture rather than kill. That was both an advantage and a disadvantage. They'd be cautious, which gave him and Lyra room to maneuver. But it also meant they'd be patient, willing to wait for the perfect moment to strike. "We need to assume they're watching us right now," Elarion said quietly. "They might have ways of tracking us that don't require physical presence. Scrying spells, bound familiars, who knows what else." He looked at Lyra. "Can you sense magic? Their magic specifically?" She considered, then nodded slowly. She could, but it wasn't precise. More like a general feeling of wrongness than a specific location. "That's something, at least. If you feel them getting close, let me know immediately." They continued on, and as the afternoon wore on, the forest began to change. The trees grew more twisted, their branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. The snow took on a faint gray tinge, as if something had leached the purity from it. The air itself felt heavier, harder to breathe. "We're entering the Shadowlands," Elarion said. "The border region where the corruption from the war never fully healed. The land itself is wounded here." Lyra moved closer to him, clearly uncomfortable. Her magic, which was pure and clean, reacted badly to the lingering darkness. She could feel it pressing against her, trying to smother her light. "Stay close," Elarion said. "We'll be through it by nightfall if we keep moving." But the Shadowlands had other ideas. The fog came on gradually, so slowly that Elarion didn't notice it at first. One moment he could see clearly for 100 yards. The next, visibility had dropped to 50, then 20, then 10, and the fog was wrong. It moved against the wind, swirling in patterns that defied natural law. It was gray-green, the color of decay, and it carried a smell like rotting flowers. "Magic," Elarion said, stopping. "The hunters are making their move." Lyra pressed against his side, her body tense. The fog was getting thicker, reducing visibility to just a few feet. Elarion could barely see his own hands when he held them in front of his face. Then the whispers started. At first they were so quiet he thought he was imagining them, just the wind moving through the trees. But they grew louder, more distinct, and he realized with growing horror that they were voices. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all whispering at once. "Failure. Coward. You let them die. Your fault. Alone forever. Not good enough." The words burrowed into his mind like worms, finding every insecurity, every regret, every fear he'd ever harbored, and dragging them into the light. The fog wasn't just obscuring vision, it was a weapon, designed to break the spirit before the body. Elarion tried to push forward, but the fog disoriented him. Which way was north? Where was the path? He couldn't tell. The world had become a gray-green void with no landmarks, no direction, no hope. You'll fail her too. She'll die because of you. Just like your father. Just like everyone you've ever cared about. No, Elarion said aloud, but his voice sounded weak even to his own ears. That's not true. Isn't it? Look at your life. Everyone leaves. Everyone dies. You're poison to those around you. He stumbled, his foot catching on something hidden beneath the snow. He fell to his knees, and the fog pressed down on him like a physical weight. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, drowning out his thoughts. Images flashed through his mind, memories twisted into nightmares. His father dying on the battlefield, calling for him, and Elarion arriving too late. His mother leaving for the West, disappointed in the son who'd chosen isolation over duty. Friends from before the war, their faces accusing him of surviving when they hadn't. And Lyra. He saw Lyra trapped again, but this time in a cage of his making. His failure to protect her, his inability to break the curse, her eyes full of betrayal as the hunters dragged her away. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the fog. "I'm so sorry. I tried, but I'm not strong enough. I'm not good enough. I never was." The fog had won. He could feel it. The weight of his failures, real and imagined, crushed him into the snow. He couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't fight. Then he felt warmth. It started at his back, a gentle heat that pushed back the cold. Then light, silver and pure, cutting through the gray-green murk. The whispers faltered, their voices losing coherence. Elarion looked up. Lyra stood before him, and she was glowing. Her antlers blazed with silver fire, and her coat shone like starlight given form. The light emanated from her in waves, pushing back the fog, creating a circle of clarity in the chaos. But it was her eyes that broke the spell. Those dark, knowing eyes looked at him with such fierce determination, such absolute refusal to give up, that something in his chest cracked open. "You are not alone," those eyes said. "You are not a failure. You are the person who saved me when no one else would. You are the person who promised to help me, and I believe in that promise. I believe in you." The fog recoiled from her light like a living thing. The whispers became screams of frustration, then faded entirely. Within moments the air was clear again, the sun visible through the trees, the path ahead obvious. Elarion stood on shaking legs, staring at Lyra in awe. That was your magic, your true magic." She nodded, but he could see the effort had cost her. Her light was dimming, her sides heaving with exertion. Using that much power in her cursed form was draining. "The starlight," Elarion breathed, remembering old legends. "You're not just any elf. You're one of the star-touched, aren't you? Born under the celestial conjunction. That's why the hunters want you. Your magic is incredibly rare." Lyra swayed slightly, exhausted, and Elarion rushed to support her. She leaned against him, her light fading to a gentle glow. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved me. I was lost in there, drowning in my own fears, and you pulled me out." She made a soft sound and pressed her nose against his cheek, a gesture of affection and reassurance. "We save each other. That's what this is." He held her for a moment, letting her rest, letting his own racing heart slow. The hunters had shown their hand. They'd tried to break him psychologically, to make him abandon Lyra, or become too paralyzed by fear to protect her. They'd failed, but they'd be back with something worse. "We need to move," Elarion said. "They know their fog didn't work. They'll try something else." Lyra straightened, gathering her strength, and nodded. They set off again, moving quickly through the Shadowlands. The encounter had shaken them both, but it had also clarified something important. They were stronger together than apart. The hunters could throw magic and fear at them, but as long as they stood united, they had a chance. As the sun began to set, they emerged from the Shadowlands into cleaner forest. The trees here were healthy, the snow white and pure. The oppressive weight that had pressed on them for hours lifted, and both of them breathed easier. "We'll camp here," Elarion decided, finding a defensible position with good sight lines. "But we'll take turns keeping watch. I don't trust the hunters to leave us alone." That night, as Elarion took the first watch, he found himself thinking about what Lyra had done. She'd used her magic, her precious, limited magic, to save him from his own mind. She could have conserved that power, saved it for breaking her curse, but she'd chosen to spend it on him instead. The weight of that choice settled over him like a cloak. She'd chosen him. Over her own freedom, over her own needs, she'd chosen to save him. He looked at her sleeping form, curled up near the small fire he'd built. In the firelight, her white coat seemed to glow softly, and he could see the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. "I won't let you down," he whispered. "I swear it on my life, Lyra. We'll reach that mountain. We'll break your curse. And then—" He paused, not sure how to finish that sentence. "And then we'll figure out what comes next. Together." The wind whispered through the trees, carrying his words away into the night. Somewhere in the darkness, the hunters were planning their next move. But here, in this small circle of firelight, Elarion and Lyra had something the hunters didn't understand and couldn't corrupt. They had each other, and that, he was beginning to realize, was the strongest magic of all. The next morning brought a change in the landscape. The dense forest began to thin, the trees growing smaller and more scattered, until finally they emerged onto the shore of a massive frozen lake. Elarion stopped at the tree line, staring out at the expanse of ice. The lake stretched for miles, its surface smooth as glass and white as bone. On the far side, barely visible through the morning mist, rose the foothills of Dragon's Peak. The mountain itself towered beyond, its summit lost in clouds. "The Lake of Mirrors," Elarion said quietly. "I'd forgotten it was here. My father brought me this way once, but it was summer then. The lake was blue and beautiful, full of fish." He studied the ice. "Crossing it will save us a day, maybe two, but it's dangerous. The ice could be unstable, especially after that storm." Lyra moved to stand beside him, looking out at the frozen expanse. She seemed to be considering, weighing the risks against the benefits. Finally, she stamped her hoof once. "Yes, we cross." "You're sure?" "If the ice breaks," she fixed him with a look that was becoming familiar. "I'm sure. We need the time. The hunters are close." She was right. Every hour they saved was an hour the hunters couldn't use to prepare another trap, and Lyra's magic might be able to sense weak spots in the ice, give them warning before disaster struck. "All right," Elarion agreed. "But we go slowly. Test every step, and if you feel anything wrong, anything at all, we turn back immediately." They stepped out onto the ice. The surface was slick despite the snow that had fallen on it. Elarion's snowshoes helped distribute his weight, but he still moved carefully, testing each step before committing his full weight. Lyra moved more easily, her hooves finding purchase where his feet would have slipped, her magic lightening her enough that the ice barely registered her presence. The lake was eerily beautiful, The ice was so clear in places that Elarion could see down into the dark water beneath, could see the shapes of rocks and sunken logs, could see the depth dropping away into blackness. It was like walking on a window into another world. "They say the lake is bottomless," Elarion said, his voice echoing strangely in the open space, "that it connects to underground rivers that run all the way to the sea. I don't know if that's true, but I know it's deep, very deep." Lyra didn't respond, all her attention focused on the ice beneath them. Elarion could see her concentration, the way her ears swiveled constantly, listening for the telltale sounds of stress and cracking. They'd been walking for perhaps an hour when the ice began to sing. It started as a low hum, almost below the threshold of hearing. Then it grew, rising in pitch and volume, until the entire lake seemed to be resonating like a vast musical instrument. The sound was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, a deep, thrumming note that vibrated through the ice and into their bones. "It's the temperature," Elarion explained, though his voice was tight with tension. "The ice expanding and contracting. It's normal. Probably." The singing grew louder, and now Elarion could see cracks appearing in the ice, not breaking through, but spreading in delicate patterns like frost on a window. They radiated out from some central point ahead, creating a web of lines that caught the light and sparkled. "Beautiful," he murmured, then immediately regretted it as the ice beneath his feet shifted slightly. Lyra froze, her ears flat against her head. She'd felt it too. The ice was unstable here. They needed to change direction, find a safer path. But before they could move, the ice spoke, not sang, spoke. A voice deep and ancient rising from the frozen water itself. "Who walks upon my surface? Who dares disturb my winter sleep?" Elarion's hand went to his bow, though he had no idea what good it would do against a lake. "We mean no disrespect," he called out. "We're travelers seeking passage to the mountain. We'll be gone by nightfall." "Travelers," the voice mused. "Yes, I see you, an elf and a doe. Or is she? No, something more, something hidden, something precious." The ice beneath them groaned and more cracks appeared. Lyra pressed close to Elarion, her body tense. "We're just passing through," Elarion said again, trying to keep his voice steady. "We don't want trouble." "Trouble follows you," the voice said. "I can taste it in the water, smell it on the wind. Darkness pursues you. The hunters of the Eclipse seek what you protect. You know of them?" "I know many things. I am old, elf. Older than your kingdoms, older than the dragons. I have slept beneath this ice for millennia, and I have seen much." The voice paused. "The question is, what will you give me for safe passage?" Elarion's jaw tightened. Of course, nothing in the old world was free. "What do you want?" "A story," the voice said, and there was something almost playful in its tone. "Tell me a story I haven't heard. Make it true, make it matter. Do this, and I will grant you passage. Fail, and, well, the lake is deep and dark, and I am always hungry." Elarion looked at Lyra. She met his gaze, and he saw trust there, and something else, encouragement. "You can do this," her eyes said. "I believe in you." He took a breath and began to speak. "Once," Elarion said, his voice carrying across the ice, "there was an elf who thought he knew what he wanted. He thought he wanted solitude, peace, a life free from the complications of others. So he built himself a cabin in the deep woods and lived there for 73 years, telling himself he was content." The ice hummed, listening. But he was lying to himself, because contentment and happiness aren't the same thing, and he'd confused one for the other. He was content in his solitude, yes, but he wasn't happy. He'd forgotten what happiness felt like. Elarion's hand found Lyra's neck, drawing strength from her presence. Then one day, he found a creature in a trap, a beautiful white doe, caught by dark magic. He could have walked away, should have walked away. It was dangerous, it wasn't his problem. It would only bring trouble, but he didn't. He freed her, even though it nearly killed him, and she stayed with him, even though she could have run. The ice was silent now, utterly still, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. They traveled together, and with every step, the elf felt something changing inside him. The walls he'd built around his heart were crumbling. The lies he'd told himself were being exposed, and he realized something terrifying and wonderful. He was falling in love, not with a form or a face, but with a spirit, with courage and kindness and fierce determination, with someone who saw him, really saw him, and chose to stay anyway. Elarion's voice grew softer, more intimate. He doesn't know how this story ends. Maybe they reach the mountain and break the curse. Maybe they fail. Maybe the darkness catches them. But he knows one thing with absolute certainty. Even if the story ends in tragedy, he wouldn't change a single moment. Because she taught him what he'd forgotten. That being alive means being vulnerable. That love is worth the risk of loss. That some cages are of our own making, and the key to freedom is simply choosing to walk through the open door. He fell silent. The ice hummed one final note, then went quiet. A true story, the voice said finally, and one that matters. Very well, elf, you have earned your passage, but know this, the hunters have set a trap for you on the far shore. They wait in the rocks, preparing their magic. You will need all your courage and all your love to survive what comes next. Thank you for the warning, Elarion said. Don't thank me yet. I have given you knowledge, but knowledge without power is just another form of helplessness. Still, I am not without mercy. I was young once, long ago. I remember what it was to love. The ice beneath them began to glow with a soft blue light. It spread out from where they stood, creating a path across the lake, a road of luminescence that led to the far shore. Follow the light, the voice said. It will take you to the safest route. And elf, when you face the hunters, remember, love is not weakness. It is the strongest magic in all the world. Stronger than their darkness, stronger than fear. Use it. The voice faded, and the lake returned to its singing, a gentler sound now, almost like a lullaby. Elarion and Lyra followed the glowing path. The ice held firm beneath them, and the cracks that had threatened to spread remained stable. The lake had granted them safe passage, and it kept its word. As they walked, Lyra moved closer to Elarion, pressing against his side. He looked down at her and saw that her eyes were bright, with tears or joy, or perhaps both. I meant every word, he said quietly, in case you were wondering. She made a sound, soft and tender, and leaned into him as they walked. They moved as one across the ice, following the path of light, and for a moment, the danger ahead didn't matter. For a moment, there was only this, two souls walking together across a frozen lake, bound by something stronger than any curse. They reached the far shore as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The light from the ice faded as soon as they stepped onto solid ground, and the lake returned to its frozen silence. Ahead, the foothills rose in a tumble of rocks and sparse trees, and somewhere in those rocks, the hunters waited. Elarion unslung his bow and strung it, his movements calm and practiced, despite the fear coiling in his gut. They'll try to separate us, he said. That's their strategy. Isolate you, trap you, take you while I'm unable to help. We can't let that happen. Lyra nodded, her body tense and ready. Stay close. Watch my back. And if I tell you to run, she stamped her hoof hard. No, we stay together. Lyra! She fixed him with a look of such fierce determination that he stopped mid-sentence. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to leave him. They would face this together or not at all. Stubborn, he said, but there was no heat in it, only affection and a growing sense of rightness. This was how it should be. This was how it had to be. They moved forward into the rocks, and the sun continued its descent, painting the snow in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere ahead, the hunters waited with their traps and their dark magic. But Elarion and Lyra had something the hunters didn't understand. They had each other. They had trust. They had love, acknowledged or not. And as the lake spirit had said, that was the strongest magic of all. The rocks closed in around them, and the light began to fade. But Elarion felt no fear. With Lyra beside him, he felt ready for whatever came next. The battle was about to begin. The rocks rose around them like broken teeth, creating a maze of narrow passages and blind corners. The sun was setting fast now, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for them with grasping fingers. Elarion moved carefully, his bow ready, every sense alert for the ambush he knew was coming. Lyra stayed close, her hooves making almost no sound on the stone. Her ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds he couldn't hear. Once she stopped him with a gentle nudge, and he saw why. A thin wire stretched across the path at ankle height, nearly invisible in the fading light. A tripwire, connected to something he couldn't see but could imagine all too well. They stepped over it carefully and continued on. The path wound upward through the rocks, sometimes widening into small clearings, sometimes narrowing to gaps barely wide enough for Elarion to squeeze through. He was beginning to think they might slip past the hunters entirely when the fog rolled in. It came from nowhere, materializing between one breath and the next. But this fog was different from the one in the Shadowlands. It was white and thick, smelling of nothing, making no sound. It simply was, surrounding them so completely that Elarion couldn't see his own feet. "Lyra?" he called softly. No response. "Lyra!" Louder now, panic edging into his voice, still nothing. He reached out, groping for her, but his hands found only fog. She'd been right beside him a moment ago. She couldn't have gone far, unless the fog had separated them, unless that was exactly what it was designed to do. Elarion forced himself to breathe slowly, to think. Panic would get him killed. The hunters wanted him disoriented, afraid, making mistakes. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. He closed his eyes, they were useless anyway in this fog, and focused on his other senses. He could hear nothing. The fog seemed to absorb sound as completely as it absorbed light. He could smell nothing. Even the scent of pine and stone had vanished. But he could feel the ground beneath his feet, the bough in his hand, the slight movement of air against his face, and something else, a warmth, faint but present, coming from his left. Lyra's magic, perhaps, the bond they'd formed over the past days, calling to him through the fog. He followed it. The fog pressed against him like a living thing, trying to turn him around, trying to make him lose his sense of direction. But he kept that warmth in his mind like a compass and pushed forward. One step, another, another. Then the whispers started again. Lost. Alone. She's gone. They have her. You failed. But this time, Elarion was ready. He'd faced these whispers before in the Shadowlands, and Lyra had shown him they were lies, weapons designed to break his spirit. He pushed through them, ignoring the words, focusing only on that distant warmth. The fog began to change. Shapes appeared in it, shadowy figures that might have been people or might have been nothing at all. They reached for him with insubstantial hands, their faces twisted in expressions of accusation and despair. "You let us die. You weren't strong enough. You'll never be strong enough." One of the figures resolved into his father's face, eyes hollow and accusing. "You dishonor my memory," the apparition said in a voice like wind through dead leaves. "Hiding in the forest while the world needed you, falling in love with a cursed creature instead of serving your people. You're a disgrace." Elarion's jaw tightened. "You're not my father. My father would never say those things." "Wouldn't I?" The apparition smiled, and it was a cruel expression. "I died a hero while you lived a coward. That's the truth you can't face." "No," Elarion said firmly. "The truth is that I loved you, and I grieved you, and I made choices you might not have agreed with. But they were my choices, my life, and I'm done letting your ghost dictate how I live it." The apparition flickered, losing coherence. "I'm done," Elarion repeated and pushed past it. More figures appeared, friends lost in the war, his mother's disappointed face, even a twisted version of Lyra accusing him of using her for his own purposes. But he walked through them all, recognizing them for what they were: illusions, lies, the hunter's desperate attempt to break him before they had to face him directly. The warmth grew stronger. He was close now. Then the fog parted, and he saw her. Lyra stood in a small clearing surrounded by rocks, and she was trapped. Not physically. There were no ropes or chains, but she stood frozen, her eyes wide with terror, staring at something Elarion couldn't see. Her whole body trembled, and small sounds of distress escaped her throat. "Lyra!" He ran to her but stopped short when he saw the runes. They were carved into the rocks around the clearing, glowing with that same sickly purple light he'd seen in the first trap. But these were different, more complex, more powerful. They weren't designed to hold her body. They were holding her mind, trapping her in some nightmare she couldn't escape. And standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the fog, were 3 figures in dark robes, the hunters of the Eclipse. "Well done, Ranger," one of them said, their voice distorted by magic. "You found her, but you're too late. She's ours now, lost in her own fears. In a few moments her mind will break completely, and she'll be nothing but an empty vessel for us to use." Elarion knocked an arrow in one smooth motion, drawing and aiming at the speaker. "Release her, now." The hunter laughed. "Or what? You'll shoot me? Go ahead. But the moment I fall, my companions will complete the ritual. She'll be lost forever. Is that what you want?" Elarion's mind raced. They were right. He couldn't fight all 3 at once, not while also trying to break whatever spell held Lyra. He needed a different approach. The lake spirit's words came back to him. Love is the strongest magic in all the world. He lowered his bow. "What are you doing?" the hunter demanded. "Something you wouldn't understand," Elarion said, and walked toward Lyra. "Stop him!" one of the other hunters shouted, but the first raised a hand. "Let him go. I want to watch him fail." Elarion ignored them, all his attention on Lyra. He could see her more clearly now, see the terror in her eyes, the way her legs shook with the effort of standing. Whatever she was seeing in her mind, it was destroying her. He stepped into the circle of runes. The moment he crossed the threshold, the nightmare hit him like a physical blow. Suddenly he was seeing what Lyra saw, experiencing what she experienced. He was trapped in a cage, a golden cage in a grand palace, beautiful and terrible. Outside the bars, faces stared at him, judging him, demanding things from him. He tried to speak, to explain, to make them understand, but he had no voice. He was an animal in their eyes, a thing to be used or displayed or forgotten. The faces changed. Now they were the hunters, reaching through the bars with hands that dripped darkness. They were taking pieces of him, draining his light, his magic, his very self. He could feel himself disappearing, becoming nothing, and there was no escape, no hope, no. The thought cut through the nightmare like a blade. This wasn't his fear, this was Lyra's, and she didn't have to face it alone. Elarion opened his eyes, when had he closed them, and found Lyra in the nightmare. She was curled on the ground now, her light flickering like a dying candle. The darkness was closing in, about to consume her completely. He knelt beside her and placed his hand on her neck. "Lyra," he said softly, "I'm here. You're not alone." She didn't respond, lost too deep in the nightmare. "I know you're afraid," he continued. "I know what it's like to feel trapped, to feel like you're losing yourself. But you're stronger than this. You're stronger than their magic. You're the person who saved me in the Shadowlands, remember? You're the person who dragged me home through a blizzard. You're the person who chose to trust a stranger in the forest." His hand moved to her head, stroking gently. "You're Lyra. You're star-touched. You carry light inside you that no darkness can extinguish. And I'm not going to let you forget that." He leaned down until his forehead touched hers, and he poured everything he felt into that contact. All the admiration, all the respect, all the growing love he'd been too afraid to name. He let it flow from him into her, a lifeline in the darkness, a reminder that she wasn't alone. "Come back," he whispered. "Come back to me, please." For a moment, nothing happened. The darkness continued to close in, and Elarion felt despair beginning to take hold. He'd failed. He wasn't enough. Then Lyra's antlers began to glow. It started as a faint shimmer, barely visible, but it grew, spreading from the antlers down through her body, pushing back the darkness, the silver light of the stars, the pure magic of her true nature, rising to answer his call. Her eyes opened, and they were clear, aware, alive. The nightmare shattered. The clearing snapped back into focus. Lyra surged to her feet, her whole body blazing with silver light. The runes on the rocks tried to hold, tried to maintain their grip, but her magic was too strong. They cracked, then shattered, purple light exploding outward in a shower of sparks. The hunters staggered back, shielding their eyes from the brilliance. "Impossible!" one of them shouted. "The spell was perfect. She should have been—" Lyra's light intensified, and suddenly it wasn't just light anymore. It was power, raw and ancient, the magic of the stars themselves channeled through her cursed form. The fog that had surrounded them burned away like morning mist before the sun. The shadows fled. Even the rocks seemed to brighten, reflecting her radiance. "She's star-touched," another hunter said, their voice filled with awe and greed. "Truly star-touched. If we can capture her, drain that power—" "You're not capturing anyone," Elarion said, his bow drawn once more. But he didn't need to shoot. Lyra was done being prey. She charged. The hunters scattered, throwing up defensive shields, but Lyra's light cut through them like they were made of paper. She wasn't attacking them physically. She was attacking their magic, unraveling the dark spells that gave them power. Everywhere her light touched, their corruption withered and died. One of the hunters tried to cast a binding spell, but Lyra's antlers flared, and the spell reflected back on its caster. The hunter cried out and collapsed, wrapped in chains of their own making. Another tried to summon shadows to fight for them, but the shadows took one look at Lyra's light and fled, refusing to obey. The third hunter, the one who'd spoken first, was smarter. They didn't try to fight. They ran, disappearing into the rocks with a speed born of terror. The The remaining hunter, still wrapped in chains, glared up at them with hate-filled eyes. "You think you've won? The Eclipse will never stop hunting her. Never. She's too valuable, too—" Lyra stepped forward, and her light intensified until the hunter had to look away. When she stepped back, the hunter was unconscious, their dark magic completely drained. The clearing fell silent. Slowly, Lyra's light dimmed, returning to the soft glow that was her normal state. She swayed slightly, exhausted by the effort, and Elarion rushed to support her. "That was incredible," he said, his voice full of wonder. "You were incredible. Are you all right?" She leaned against him, breathing hard, but nodded. She was tired, but whole. The nightmare hadn't broken her. If anything, breaking free of it had made her stronger. "The third one got away," Elarion said, looking in the direction the hunter had fled. "They'll warn the others, maybe bring reinforcements." Lyra stamped her hoof and jerked her head toward the mountain. Her meaning was clear. "Then we need to move faster." "Agreed. Can you walk?" She gave him a look that clearly said, "Can you?" And he laughed despite everything. "Fair point. Come on, then. Let's get out of here before they regroup." They left the clearing, stepping over the unconscious hunter without a second glance. The fog was gone, burned away by Lyra's light, and the path ahead was clear. The mountain loomed closer now, its peak visible against the darkening sky. As they climbed higher into the foothills, Elarion found himself glancing at Lyra with new understanding. He'd known she was powerful. Her magic had saved him twice now. But seeing her face the hunters, seeing her break their spell through sheer force of will and the strength of her true nature, had been something else entirely. She wasn't just a cursed elf who needed rescuing. She was a force of nature, a being of immense power who'd been trapped and diminished, but never truly defeated. The curse had bound her form, but it hadn't touched her spirit. "When you're restored," he said quietly, "when you have your true form back and full access to your magic, you're going to be magnificent." She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something that made his heart skip. Not just gratitude or affection, but something deeper, something that matched what he felt. "I already am magnificent," her look said. "You saw that. You saw me when I was trapped and powerless, and you thought I was magnificent anyway. That's why—" She didn't finish the thought, but she didn't need to. He understood. They climbed on into the night, leaving the hunters and their traps behind. The mountain waited ahead, and with it the promise of answers, of freedom, of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. Behind them, in the clearing, the unconscious hunter began to stir. They would wake soon and carry word back to their masters. The Eclipse would know that their prey was stronger than expected, that the ranger protecting her was more than just an obstacle. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, Elarion and Lyra had won. They'd faced the darkness together and emerged into the light. And with each step toward the mountain, that light grew stronger. Dawn found them at the base of Dragon's Peak proper, where the foothills gave way to the mountain itself. The change was dramatic. One moment they were walking through scattered rocks and hardy shrubs. The next they stood before a wall of stone that rose so high its summit was lost in clouds. Elarion tilted his head back, trying to see the top, and felt a moment of vertigo. "I'd forgotten how big it is," he said quietly. "When I was here with my father, I was too young to really appreciate the scale." Lyra stood beside him, equally awed. The mountain was ancient beyond measure, its stone worn smooth by millennia of wind and weather. But there was something else about it, a presence, a weight that had nothing to do with physical mass. This was a sacred place, a place where the world was thin and magic ran deep. "The path starts there," Elarion said, pointing to a narrow trail that switchbacked up the mountain face. "It's called the Pilgrim's Stair. The old elves carved it when they first came to this land, seeking the dragon's wisdom. It's supposed to lead all the way to the summit, but I've never climbed that far." He studied the path with a ranger's eye, noting the places where rock falls had damaged it, where ice had made it treacherous. It would be a hard climb, possibly taking 2 days or more, and they'd be exposed the entire time. If the hunters caught up with them on that narrow trail, there would be nowhere to run. "We should rest first," he said. "Eat, gather our strength. The climb will take everything we have." Lyra nodded agreement, and they found a sheltered spot among the rocks at the mountain's base. Elarion built a small fire and prepared what might be their last hot meal for days. The food was simple: porridge made from grain he'd brought, sweetened with dried berries, but it was warm and filling. As they ate, Elarion found himself studying Lyra. She'd been quiet since the encounter with the hunters, more withdrawn than usual. He could see the exhaustion in every line of her body. Using that much magic had drained her severely. But there was something else, too, a pensiveness that worried him. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment, then stood and walked to a patch of snow. Using her hoof, she began to write, the letters clumsy but readable. "What if it doesn't work?" Ilarion's chest tightened. "The dragon, you mean? What if it can't break the curse?" She nodded, and he saw fear in her eyes. Not the terror of the hunter's nightmare, but something quieter and more profound. The fear of hope disappointed, of reaching the end of a long journey only to find nothing there. He stood and went to her, placing his hand on her neck. "Then we find another way. We don't give up. We keep searching until we find someone or something that can help you." "But what if there is no other way?" "There's always another way," he said firmly. "Always. I don't care if we have to search every library in every kingdom, consult every mage and wise woman and hedge witch from here to the southern sea. We'll find a way to break this curse. I promise you that." She leaned into his touch, and he could feel her trembling. The strong, fierce creature who'd faced down the hunters was gone, replaced by someone vulnerable and afraid. It reminded him that beneath the magic and the courage, she was just a person who'd been trapped for 4 years, who'd endured things he couldn't imagine, who was so close to freedom she could taste it, but terrified it might be snatched away at the last moment. "Hey," he said softly, tilting her head so she had to meet his eyes. "Whatever happens up there, you're not alone, you understand? Even if the dragon can't help, even if we have to spend years searching for another solution, I'm not leaving you. We're in this together." Tears welled in her dark eyes, and one spilled over, tracing down her muzzle. He wiped it away gently. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But we've come this far, haven't we? We've survived storms and hunters and our own fears. We can survive whatever comes next." She closed her eyes and pressed her forehead against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her neck, holding her close. They stood like that for a long time, drawing strength from each other, until finally Lyra pulled back and stamped her hoof once. "Yes, we can do this." "That's my girl," Elarion said, and was rewarded with a look that was half exasperation, half affection. They finished their meal and prepared for the climb. Elarion redistributed the contents of his pack, leaving behind everything that wasn't absolutely essential. Every ounce would matter on that steep trail. He kept food, water, rope, medical supplies, and his weapons. Everything else stayed behind. "Ready?" he asked when they stood at the base of the Pilgrim's Stair. Lyra looked up at the mountain, then back at him, and nodded. They began to climb. The first hour wasn't too bad. The trail was wide enough for them to walk side by side, and the grade, while steep, was manageable. The stone beneath their feet was solid, worn smooth by countless pilgrims over countless years. But as they climbed higher, the trail narrowed and the grade increased. Soon they were moving single file, Elarion leading the way, testing each step before committing his weight. The drop-off to their right grew more severe, falling away into dizzying space. Elarion tried not to look down. He'd never been afraid of heights, but there was something about this particular drop that made his stomach clench. Maybe it was the knowledge that a single misstep would mean a fall of hundreds of feet onto unforgiving rocks. Maybe it was the responsibility he felt for Lyra, the need to get her safely to the summit. Or maybe it was just the mountain itself, reminding him how small he was, how fragile, how easily the stone could shrug him off like an unwanted insect. They climbed in silence, saving their breath for the effort. The air was growing thinner, each inhalation bringing less oxygen than the one before. Elarion's legs burned, his lungs ached, and his pack seemed to grow heavier with each step. Behind him, he could hear Lyra's hooves clicking on stone, her breathing slightly labored. She was struggling too, her magic unable to fully compensate for the physical demands of the climb. Around midday, they reached a wider section of trail where a rockfall had created a natural platform. Elarion called a halt and they both collapsed gratefully, too tired to do more than drink water and catch their breath. "We're maybe a third of the way up," Elarion said, studying the trail ahead. "At this pace, we won't reach the summit until tomorrow afternoon at the earliest." Lyra nodded, too exhausted to respond even with her usual gestures. "There's supposed to be a shelter somewhere ahead," Elarion continued. "A cave the old pilgrims used as a way station. If we can reach it before dark, we'll have a safe place to spend the night." They rested for half an hour, then continued. The trail grew steeper, the switchbacks tighter. In places, rockfalls had damaged the path, forcing them to climb over or around obstacles. Once, Elarion had to use his rope to help Lyra up a particularly steep section, pulling while she scrambled with her hooves, both of them straining with effort. When they finally cleared the obstacle, they stood panting, pressed against the mountain face, and Elarion found himself laughing despite his exhaustion. "What's funny?" Lyra's look seemed to ask. "Nothing," he said. "Everything. Here we are, climbing a mountain that might kill us, chasing a dragon that might not exist, trying to break a curse that might be unbreakable. And I'm happier than I've been in 73 years. She tilted her head, considering, then made a soft sound that might have been agreement. Despite everything, the danger, the exhaustion, the uncertainty, there was something right about this, something true. They were exactly where they were supposed to be. The afternoon wore on and the trail continued its relentless ascent. Elarion's legs felt like lead, his shoulders ached from the pack's weight, and his hands were raw from gripping stone. But he kept moving, one step at a time, and Lyra kept pace beside him. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Elarion spotted a dark opening in the mountain face ahead. "There," he said, pointing. "The shelter." They covered the last 100 yards with renewed energy, practically stumbling into the cave. It was larger than Elarion had expected. A natural cavern perhaps 20 feet deep and 15 wide, with a ceiling high enough to stand upright. The back wall showed evidence of old fires, and someone had stacked wood there long ago, dried now to perfect kindling. "Bless the old pilgrims," Elarion said, dropping his pack with relief. They knew how to prepare. He got a fire going while Lyra explored the cave, sniffing at corners and checking for threats. Finding none, she returned to the fire and lay down with a sigh of exhaustion. Elarion prepared a simple dinner, and they ate in comfortable silence, too tired for communication. Outside, the last light faded from the sky, and stars began to appear. More stars than Elarion had ever seen, bright and sharp in the thin mountain air. "Look," he said, pointing to the cave entrance. Lyra raised her head and saw what he was seeing. The sky had come alive with color. The northern lights, the aurora, danced across the heavens in waves of green and blue and purple. They rippled like curtains in a celestial wind, so beautiful it hurt to look at them. "I've only seen them a few times in my life," Elarion said quietly. "They're supposed to be the spirits of the ancient dragons, dancing in the sky, a blessing on those who see them." Lyra stood and walked to the cave entrance, transfixed by the display. Elarion joined her, and they stood side by side, watching the lights dance. In that moment, with the aurora painting the sky and the mountains solid beneath their feet, Elarion felt something shift inside him. All the walls he'd built, all the defenses he'd erected against feeling too much, caring too much, loving too much, they crumbled completely. He was in love with her. Completely, irrevocably in love. Not with a form or a face he'd never seen, but with her spirit, her courage, her fierce determination to be free, with the way she'd saved him from his own fears, the way she'd chosen to stay when she could have run, the way she looked at him like he was worth something. "Lyra," he said softly. She turned to look at him, and in the aurora's light, her eyes were luminous. "When we break the curse," he said, "when you have your voice back and can speak your own words, there's something I need to tell you, something important. Will you listen?" She stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his, and nodded slowly. "Good," he said, and smiled. "That's good." They stood together at the cave entrance, watching the aurora dance, and neither of them noticed the cold. They had each other, and the promise of tomorrow, and the hope that at the summit they would find the answers they sought. The mountain rose above them, patient and eternal, holding its secrets close. But they would reach those secrets. They would climb until they found the dragon, and they would break the curse, and then they would see what came next. Together, they woke to a world transformed by ice. During the night, a freezing mist had rolled up the mountain, coating everything in a crystalline shell. The rocks glittered like diamonds. The sparse vegetation was encased in glass, and the trail ahead looked more like a skating rink than a path. Elarion stood at the cave entrance, assessing the situation with growing concern. "This is going to make the climb much more dangerous," he said. "Every step will be treacherous." Lyra joined him, her breath pluming white in the frigid air. She studied the ice-covered trail, then looked up at the summit, still hidden in clouds. They were so close, perhaps half a day's climb under normal conditions. But these weren't normal conditions. She stamped her hoof decisively. "We keep going." "I know," Elarion said. "We don't have a choice. The hunters are behind us, and staying here just gives them time to catch up." He turned to look at her. "But we have to be even more careful. One slip on this ice and—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They both knew what a fall would mean. They ate a quick breakfast, the last of their food, Elarion realized with a pang. They were committed now. Reach the summit or starve trying. He packed away the empty food bags and shouldered his pack, lighter now but still a burden on the steep climb ahead. "Stay close," he said. "If one of us slips, maybe the other can—" Lyra pressed her nose against his hand, cutting off his words. Her eyes were calm, trusting. "We'll be fine. We've come this far." He squeezed her neck gently, drawing strength from her confidence, then stepped out onto the icy trail. The first few steps confirmed his fears. The ice was treacherous, offering almost no grip. His boots slipped, and only a quick grab at the rock wall kept him upright. Behind him, Lyra's hooves scraped and slid, but her magic helped. She could lighten herself enough to stay on top of the ice rather than breaking through it. They moved at a crawl, testing each step, using hands and hooves to grip any purchase they could find. The drop-off to their right seemed even more menacing now, a yawning void waiting to swallow them if they made a single mistake. An hour passed, then 2. They covered perhaps a quarter mile, every yard earned through sweat and fear and stubborn determination. Elarion's hands were numb despite his gloves, his legs trembled with exhaustion, and his heart hammered against his ribs. Then the trail rounded a corner and he saw what lay ahead. A section of the path had collapsed, recently judging by the fresh rock debris below. What remained was a ledge perhaps a foot wide, running for 20 feet before the trail widened again. To cross it, they'd have to press themselves against the mountain face and shuffle sideways, with nothing but air and a fatal drop beneath them. And it was coated in ice. "No," Elarion breathed. "No, there has to be another way." But there wasn't. The mountain face above was sheer and unclimbable. The drop below was certain death. The only way forward was across that narrow, ice-covered ledge. Lyra came up beside him and assessed the situation. He saw her body tense, saw the fear flash across her features. But then she straightened, lifted her head, and took a step toward the ledge. "Wait!" Elarion grabbed her. "Let me go first. If I fall, you can still—" She shook her head firmly and pulled away from his grip. Her meaning was clear. "If you fall, I fall. We do this together." "Lyra, please!" She fixed him with a look that silenced all arguments, then carefully stepped onto the ledge. Elarion's heart stopped as he watched her move sideways, her hooves scraping for purchase on the ice-slicked stone. She moved with agonizing slowness, each step deliberate and controlled. The wind picked up, tugging at her, trying to pull her off the mountain. Halfway across, her hoof slipped. Elarion lunged forward without thinking, but she caught herself, her magic flaring bright as she somehow found purchase on the ice. She stood frozen for a moment, sides heaving, then continued. When she reached the other side, she turned and looked back at him. "Your turn." Elarion took a deep breath, said a prayer to any gods that might be listening, and stepped onto the ledge. The world immediately narrowed to the few inches of stone beneath his feet, and the rock face pressed against his chest. He couldn't look down. Looking down would be fatal. He focused on the stone in front of his face, on the small cracks and imperfections that his fingers could grip, and moved sideways one shuffling step at a time. The wind hit him like a fist, nearly tearing him from the mountain. He pressed harder against the rock, his fingers screaming as they gripped tiny holds. Another step, another. The drop pulled at him, gravity itself seeming to reach up and try to drag him down. His foot slipped. For one terrible moment, he was falling, the world tilting sideways, the void opening beneath him. His fingers scrabbled uselessly at smooth ice, finding no purchase. This was it. This was how it ended. Then something caught his cloak. He looked up and saw Lyra. Her teeth clamped on the fabric, her whole body braced against the mountain. She was holding him, using strength that should have been impossible for her size, her magic burning bright as she refused to let him fall. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Elarion saw everything she couldn't say. "I've got you. I won't let go. Not now, not ever." He found a foothold, then another, and pulled himself back onto the ledge. Lyra maintained her grip on his cloak until he was stable, then released it. They stood there, pressed against the mountain, both shaking with adrenaline and relief. "Thank you," Elarion gasped. She made a soft sound, always, and waited while he gathered himself. The last few feet of the ledge passed in a blur of terror and determination. When Elarion finally stepped onto the wider section of trail, his legs gave out and he collapsed, gasping. Lyra pressed against him, and he wrapped his arms around her neck, holding on as if she were the only solid thing in a world gone mad. "We made it," he said when he could speak again. "We actually made it, but they weren't safe yet." Even as relief flooded through him, Elarion heard something that made his blood run cold. Voices, coming from below. The hunters had caught up. Elarion pulled himself to his feet, every muscle protesting. "How many?" he asked Lyra, who was staring back down the trail with her ears forward. She stamped her hoof 3 times. 3 hunters. Probably the ones who'd escaped the previous encounter. Possibly with reinforcements. "They'll have to cross that ledge too," Elarion said, thinking quickly. "That gives us time. We need to reach the summit before they catch up." They pushed on, moving as fast as the icy trail would allow. The path grew steeper, the air thinner. Elarion's lungs burned with each breath, his vision starting to blur at the edges from altitude and exhaustion. But he kept moving, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant capture or death. Behind them, he could hear the hunters now, their voices echoing off the stone, calling to each other in a language he didn't recognize. They were moving faster than he and Lyra could, unencumbered by exhaustion or fear of falling. They were gaining. The trail made one final switchback, and suddenly they were above the clouds. The summit plateau spread before them, a flat expanse of snow and ice perhaps 200 yards across, and at its center, rising like a cathedral of crystal and stone, was the spire. "The dragon's lair," Elarion breathed, but there was no time to marvel. The hunters were close now. He could hear their boots on stone, could feel the wrongness of their magic pressing against his senses. "Run!" he shouted to Lyra. They sprinted across the plateau, their feet kicking up snow, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The spire grew larger as they approached, its crystalline walls catching the light and throwing rainbows across the snow. Elarion could see an entrance, a great arched doorway carved with symbols he didn't recognize. They were 50 yards away when the first spell hit. A bolt of purple energy sizzled past Elarion's head, so close he felt its heat. He dove sideways, rolling in the snow, and came up with his bow drawn. 3 figures in dark robes stood at the edge of the plateau, their hands already weaving another spell. "Lyra, go!" Elarion shouted. "Get to the dragon! I'll hold them off!" She skidded to a stop and turned back, her eyes wide with protest. "Go!" He loosed an arrow at the nearest hunter, forcing them to dodge. "This is what I do. I'm a ranger. I protect. Now run!" For a moment he thought she'd refuse. Then she turned and sprinted for the spire, her white form flying across the snow like a ghost. The hunters saw her fleeing and redoubled their efforts. More spells flew, bolts of energy, grasping shadows, waves of force that churned the snow. Elarion dodged and rolled, returning fire when he could, but he was outmatched. 3 sorcerers against 1 ranger. The math was simple and brutal. A spell caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Pain exploded through his body, and he fell to his knees. His bow tumbled from nerveless fingers. Through blurring vision, he saw the hunters advancing, their hands glowing with dark magic. "Nowhere to run, Ranger," one of them said. "You've been a nuisance, but this ends now. Tell us, was she worth dying for?" Elarion looked toward the spire. Lyra had reached the entrance and was looking back at him, her body outlined against the crystalline walls. Even from this distance, he could see the anguish in her posture. "Yes," he said simply. "She was worth everything." The hunters raised their hands for the killing blow. Then Lyra charged. She came like a comet, like a falling star, her entire body blazing with silver light. The hunters turned, but too late. She crashed into them with the force of a battering ram, her antlers lowered, her magic burning so bright it was painful to look at. The first hunter went down with a scream, their dark magic unraveling under the onslaught of her light. The second tried to cast a binding spell, but Lyra was too fast, too fierce. She wheeled and struck with her hooves, and the hunter collapsed. The third hunter was smarter. They didn't try to fight. They ran, disappearing back down the trail, their robes flapping behind them. Silence fell across the plateau. Lyra stood among the fallen hunters, her sides heaving, her light slowly dimming. She'd used almost everything she had left, burned through her reserves to save him. She swayed, exhausted beyond measure, and Elarion forced himself to his feet despite the pain. "You came back," he said, stumbling toward her. "You were almost there. You could have reached the dragon. Why did you come back?" She looked at him, and her eyes held the answer. "Because you're more important than the curse. Because I'd rather stay trapped forever than lose you. Because I love you." Elarion reached her and wrapped his arms around her neck, holding her as tightly as he dared. "You magnificent, stubborn, impossible creature," he whispered. "I love you too. I love you so much it terrifies me." She made a sound, half laugh, half sob, and leaned into him. They stood like that for a long moment, two battered souls holding each other up, surrounded by fallen enemies and the vast silence of the mountain. Then, together, they turned toward the spire. The entrance waited, dark and mysterious and full of promise. Whatever lay inside, dragon or disappointment, salvation or sorrow, they would face it together. Elarion retrieved his bow with his good arm, and Lyra moved to support his injured side. Step by step, they crossed the remaining distance to the spire and passed through the ancient doorway into the darkness beyond. Behind them, the two conscious hunters began to stir, but by then it was too late. Elarion and Lyra had entered the dragon's lair, and the great doors swung shut behind them with a sound like thunder, sealing them inside. The final test had begun. The darkness inside the spire was absolute. Elarion stood just inside the entrance, one hand pressed against the cold stone wall, the other gripping his bow, despite knowing it would be useless against whatever they might face here. His injured shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and he could feel blood seeping through his shirt. The hunter's spell had done more damage than he'd initially thought. Beside him, Lyra's breathing was labored, her exhaustion evident in every line of her body. She'd given everything to save him, and now they were both running on fumes and stubborn will. "We need light," Elarion murmured, and fumbled in his pack for the small lantern he'd brought. His hands shook as he lit it, the flame guttering before catching. Warm light pushed back the darkness, revealing wonder. They stood in a vast chamber that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The spire had looked large from outside, but this space was enormous. A cathedral carved from living crystal that soared hundreds of feet overhead. The walls were translucent, catching the lantern light and multiplying it 1,000-fold, until the entire chamber glowed with soft radiance. And everywhere there were carvings. Dragons in flight, dragons at rest, dragons breathing fire and ice and lightning, elves standing before them in supplication or celebration, stars and moons and suns wheeling in cosmic dances, the history of a world when magic was young and dragons walked freely among the mortal races. "It's beautiful," Elarion breathed. Lyra moved forward, her hooves clicking on the crystal floor, and Elarion followed. The chamber stretched ahead of them, and at its far end he could see stairs, a spiral staircase carved from the same crystal as the walls, ascending into the heights of the spire. They climbed. Each step was an agony for Elarion, his wounded shoulders screaming protest, his legs barely able to support his weight. Lyra stayed close, letting him lean on her when he needed to, her presence a constant reassurance. The stairs seemed endless, spiraling up and up into darkness that even the crystal walls couldn't fully illuminate. Elarion lost count of the steps, lost track of time. There was only the climb, the pain, and Lyra beside him. Then, finally, they emerged into another chamber. This one was circular, perhaps 100 feet across, with a domed ceiling that rose to a point high above. But it was what occupied the center of the chamber that stole Elarion's breath and made Lyra freeze in her tracks. The crystal dragon. It was vast beyond comprehension, its body coiled in the center of the chamber like a sleeping cat. But where a cat might be 3 feet long, this creature was easily 200 feet from nose to tail. Its scales were made of crystal, actual crystal, clear and perfect, refracting light into 1,000 colors. Its wings, folded against its sides, looked like they were carved from diamond. Its claws were obsidian, black and sharp as razors, and it was covered in ice. Not just covered, encased. A thick layer of frost and ice coated every inch of the dragon's body, turning it into a sculpture of winter itself. Icicles hung from its wings, its claws, its jaw. Its eyes were closed, frozen shut, and its chest rose and fell so slowly that Elarion had to watch for a full minute to confirm it was breathing at all. "It's real," Elarion whispered. "The legend is real. The crystal dragon exists." But it wasn't awake. It was sleeping, had been sleeping for who knew how long, centuries, millennia. The ice suggested it had been here since the last age of the world, dreaming dreams that mortals couldn't comprehend. Lyra took a hesitant step forward, then another. She approached the dragon slowly, reverently, as if approaching a shrine. Elarion followed, his ranger's instincts screaming warnings that he ignored. They hadn't come this far to turn back now. As they drew closer, Elarion could see more details. The dragon's scales weren't just crystal. They contained images, scenes frozen in their depths like insects in amber. He saw battles and celebrations, births and deaths, the rise and fall of kingdoms. Each scale was a story, and the dragon wore the history of the world on its skin. "How do we wake it?" Elarion asked, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Lyra or himself. Lyra didn't answer. She was staring at the dragon with an intensity that bordered on desperation. This was it, the end of their journey, the hope she'd clung to for 4 years. If the dragon couldn't help her, if it refused or was unable to break the curse, then what? Where would they go? What would they do? She took another step forward, and another, until she stood directly before the dragon's massive head. It was easily the size of a house, its jaws large enough to swallow a horse whole. Even in sleep, even encased in ice, it radiated power. Ancient, terrible, magnificent power. Lyra raised her head and called out. The sound that emerged from her throat was nothing like a deer's bleat. It was pure magic, a note of such clarity and beauty that it made Elarion's eyes water. It resonated through the chamber, making the crystal walls sing in harmony, building in volume and intensity until the entire spire was vibrating with it. The ice on the dragon began to crack. It started small, tiny fissures spreading across the frozen surface like lightning. Then larger cracks, pieces of ice falling away to shatter on the floor. The dragon's breathing quickened, its chest rising and falling more rapidly. The temperature in the chamber began to rise, the ice melting, running in rivulets down the dragon's crystalline scales. Lyra's call reached a crescendo, then cut off abruptly. She swayed, completely drained, and Elarion rushed to support her. Together they watched as the last of the ice fell away, revealing the dragon in all its glory. For a moment nothing happened. The dragon lay still, its eyes closed, its breathing steady but slow. Then, with a sound like a glacier calving, one eye opened. It was golden. Pure, molten gold, without pupil or iris, just an endless expanse of liquid light. That eye focused on Lyra, and Elarion felt the weight of its attention like a physical force. This was a being that had existed since the dawn of time, that had seen the world born and would likely see it die. Compared to it, he and Lyra were mayflies, brief sparks of life in the endless dark. The dragon's voice, when it spoke, wasn't heard with ears, but felt in the bones, the soul, the very essence of being. Child of stars, you have called, and I have answered. Speak your need. Lyra stepped forward, away from Elarion's support, and stood before the dragon with her head held high. She couldn't speak with words, but her meaning was clear in every line of her body, every desperate gesture. I am cursed, trapped. I need your help to be free. The dragon's eye moved, studying her, seeing through her physical form to the magic and spirit beneath. Elarion held his breath, waiting for judgment. Yes, the dragon said finally. I see the curse, dark magic, woven with malice and bound with blood. It is strong, but not stronger than I. Hope flared in Elarion's chest, so intense it was painful. But, the dragon continued, and that hope faltered. Breaking such a curse requires a price. Magic is balance. To unmake what was made, something must be given in return. Lyra stamped her hoof. Anything. I'll pay any price. Not your price to pay, child. The curse was placed on you, but it was maintained by your isolation, your despair, your belief that you were alone. It was broken not by magic, but by love. Therefore, love must be the price. The dragon's eye shifted to Elarion. Ranger, you have walked beside her, protected her, loved her though you knew not her true form. You have given her hope when she had none. Your love has already begun to break the curse. I merely finish what you started. Elarion's throat tightened. What do you mean? What price? The curse will break. She will be restored. But the magic that binds you together, the bond you have forged on this journey, will be severed. You will remember each other, but the connection, the certainty, the absolute knowledge that you belong together, that will be gone. You will be as strangers who once knew each other. Whether you find your way back to each other will be your choice, made without the influence of magic or fate. No, Elarion said immediately. There has to be another way. Take something else, my magic, my memories, my life if you have to, but don't take what we have. What you have is precious precisely because it was forged in hardship, but for it to be real, it must be chosen freely, without the influence of the journey that created it. This is the price. This is the balance. Lyra made a sound of anguish and turned to Elarion, her eyes pleading. Don't let them do this. Don't let them take what we have. But Elarion understood what the dragon was saying. The bond they'd formed, it was real, but it had been forged in extreme circumstances. Fear, danger, dependence. These things could create connections that felt like love, but were really just survival instinct. For what they had to be true, it had to be tested. They had to choose each other without the weight of the journey influencing that choice. It's the only way, he said softly. taking Lyra's face in his hands. "You'll be free, your true form restored. That's what matters." She shook her head violently. "You matter. This matters. And if it's real, if what we feel is real, we'll find our way back to each other. I promise you, Lyra. I will find you, I will remember you, and I will love you all over again, curse or no curse, bond or no bond." Tears streamed down her muzzle, and Elarion felt his own eyes burning. "Do it," he said to the dragon. "Break the curse. We'll pay the price." "So be it." The dragon opened its other eye, and suddenly the chamber was filled with golden light. It poured from the dragon like water from a broken dam, washing over Lyra, surrounding her, lifting her off the ground. She cried out, not in pain, but in shock, as the light intensified, becoming so bright that Elarion had to shield his eyes. He could feel it happening, the bond between them stretching, thinning, beginning to fray. The absolute certainty he'd felt, the knowledge that Lyra was his and he was hers, started to fade. Panic seized him. He reached out trying to hold on to that connection, but it slipped through his fingers like water. "Lyra," he shouted, "I love you. Remember that. Whatever happens, remember that I love you." The light reached a blinding crescendo, and Elarion felt the bond snap. The loss was immediate and devastating. It felt like a part of his soul had been torn away, leaving a wound that ached with every breath. He fell to his knees, gasping, one hand pressed against his chest as if he could somehow hold the pieces of himself together. The light faded, and where the White Doe had stood, a woman knelt on the crystal floor. For a moment, Elarion couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare. She was beautiful. Lyra knelt on the crystal floor, her hands pressed against the cold surface, her head bowed as if in prayer or exhaustion. Her hair fell around her like a curtain of silver starlight, so long it pooled on the ground beside her. She wore a simple white dress that seemed to be woven from moonbeams and mist. Whether it had been created by the dragon's magic, or had been there all along hidden by the curse, Elarion couldn't tell. Slowly she raised her head. Her face was elegant, with high cheekbones and a delicate jaw that spoke of noble lineage. Her skin was pale as snow, luminous in the dragon's fading light. But it was her eyes that captured him, those same dark, knowing eyes he'd stared into for days, now set in an elven face of heartbreaking beauty. They were eyes that had seen too much sorrow, but also held depths of strength and courage. She looked at him, and he saw recognition there. She knew him. But the certainty, the absolute knowledge of connection that had existed between them moments ago, it was gone. She looked at him the way one might look at a stranger who'd once done them a great kindness, with gratitude, with fondness, but without the bone-deep certainty that they belonged together. The dragon had kept its word. The bond was broken. "Elarion," she said, and her voice was like music, like wind chimes in a summer breeze. After days of silence, hearing her speak his name was almost painful in its beauty. You saved me." He wanted to run to her, to pull her into his arms and never let go. But something held him back. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the fear that she wouldn't want him now that she was free, now that she could see him clearly without the lens of their shared journey. Would she still choose him? "We saved each other," he said, his voice rough. "That's what we did. We saved each other." Lyra tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't support her. She'd been a doe for 4 years. Her body had forgotten how to be elven. Elarion moved without thinking, crossing the distance between them and catching her before she fell. The moment he touched her, something sparked. Not the bond, that was gone, but something else. A recognition that went deeper than magic, deeper than fate. his hands on her arms, her hands gripping his shoulders, and for a moment they were frozen, staring at each other. "I remember everything," she whispered. "The cabin, the journey, the storm. You holding me in the shelter, you breaking the trap, you facing the hunters. I remember all of it." "So do I," Elarion said. "Every moment. But it feels different now, like it happened to someone else, like I'm watching a memory through glass." Her eyes filled with tears. "The dragon said this would happen, that we'd remember, but the certainty would be gone. I just didn't realize how much it would hurt." Elarion's chest ached. He wanted to tell her it didn't matter, that he still loved her, that nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The bond that had made their connection feel inevitable was gone, and what remained was just two people who'd shared an extraordinary experience but now had to figure out who they were to each other, without magic guiding them. "Can you stand?" he asked gently. She nodded, and together they managed to get her upright. She swayed, leaning heavily on him, her legs shaking with effort. He supported her weight easily, and they stood there in the dragon's chamber, neither quite sure what to do next. "The curse is broken," the dragon said, its voice softer now, almost gentle. "You are restored, child of stars. Your magic, your form, your voice, all returned to you." Lyra looked up at the massive creature, and Elarion saw gratitude and sorrow warring in her expression. "Thank you," she said. Thank you. But the price was necessary. What you had was born of desperation and danger. For it to become real, it must be chosen freely, without the weight of circumstance. You have been given a gift, though it may not feel like one now, the gift of choice. "Some gift," Elarion muttered, the dragon's golden eye fixed on him, and he felt the weight of its ancient wisdom. "Ranger, you have lived in isolation for decades, telling yourself it was what you wanted. She has lived in a cage, first of expectations, then of magic. Both of you have been prisoners. I have freed her from her curse. Now you must free yourselves from yours." "I don't understand," Elarion said. "You will, in time." The dragon's eyes began to close, the golden light dimming. "My part in your story is complete. What comes next is yours to write. Choose wisely, choose truly, and remember, love that is real does not need magic to sustain it. It sustains itself." The great eyes closed completely, and the dragon's breathing slowed once more. Within moments, frost began to form on its scales, ice creeping back across its crystalline body. It was returning to its slumber, its brief awakening complete. Elarion and Lyra stood in the growing silence, alone together but feeling more separate than they had since the moment they'd met. "We should go," Lyra said finally, her voice small, "before the ice seals the chamber completely." Elarion nodded and helped her toward the stairs. She moved awkwardly, like a fawn learning to walk, and he found himself automatically adjusting his pace to match hers, supporting her when she stumbled. Some things, it seemed, didn't require a magical bond. Some things were just natural. The descent was slow and painful. Lyra's legs grew steadier as they went, muscle memory gradually returning, but she still needed his support. They didn't speak. There was too much to say, and no words adequate to say it. When they finally emerged from the spire, the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. The plateau was empty. The hunters had fled or died, and their bodies had been covered by fresh snow. The world was clean and new and utterly indifferent to the drama that had unfolded. "Where will you go?" Elarion asked, the question tearing at him even as he spoke it. "Back to your family? Your city?" Lyra was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains stretching endlessly in every direction. "I don't know," she said finally. "I've been gone for 4 years. My family probably thinks I'm dead, And even if they don't, I'm not the same person who left. I don't know if I can go back to that life. The expectations, the duties, the cage of nobility. She looked at him. What about you? Back to your cabin? I don't know either, he admitted. It feels like going back would be going backward, like trying to fit into a space I've outgrown. He managed a weak smile. You've ruined me for solitude, it seems. I'm sorry, she said softly. Don't be. It needed ruining. They stood in silence, watching the sun sink lower. The cold was biting, and Elarion realized they needed shelter soon. His wounded shoulder had stopped bleeding but ached fiercely, and Lyra was shivering in her thin dress, her body not yet adjusted to maintaining its own temperature without the doe's thick coat. There's a shepherd's hut about 2 hours down the mountain, Elarion said. If it's still standing, we can shelter there for the night, then figure out what comes next in the morning. Lyra nodded, and they began the descent. The hut was still standing, barely. It was a rough structure of stone and wood, built to shelter shepherds during the summer months when they brought their flocks to the high pastures. Now, in deep winter, it was abandoned, but intact. Elarion got a fire going, while Lyra sat wrapped in his cloak, watching the flames with distant eyes. He'd given her the cloak without thinking, and she'd accepted it without comment. Small gestures of care that didn't require words or bonds. He heated water and cleaned his wound as best he could, biting back curses at the pain. The hunter's spell had burned through skin and muscle, leaving a mark that would scar. Lyra watched him struggle for a moment, then moved to help, her hands gentle as she cleaned and bandaged the injury. "Thank you," he said when she finished. "You've done the same for me countless times," she replied. "It's only fair." They ate in silence. Elarion had found some emergency rations in the hut, left by shepherds long ago. The food was stale but edible. Lyra ate slowly, as if relearning the mechanics of chewing and swallowing. "It's strange," she said after a while. "Being myself again. I thought it would feel like coming home, but it feels more like putting on clothes that used to fit but don't quite anymore." "You've changed," Elarion said. "The curse changed you. The journey changed you. You can't expect to be the same person you were 4 years ago." "No," she agreed. "I can't." She looked at him across the fire. "You've changed too. You're not the solitary ranger content with his isolation anymore." "No," he echoed. "I'm not." Another silence fell, but this one was less comfortable. There was a tension in the air, a weight of unspoken things pressing down on them both. Finally, Lyra spoke. "Elarion, I need to tell you something. Before the curse is completely behind us, before we go our separate ways—" "We don't have to go separate ways," he interrupted. She smiled sadly. "Don't we? The bond is gone. What we felt, what we thought we felt, it was born of extreme circumstances. You said it yourself to the dragon. We need to choose freely without the influence of the journey." "I am choosing freely," Elarion said, his voice intense. "Right now, with no bond, no magic, no life or death situation forcing us together, I'm choosing you." "You don't know me," Lyra said gently. "Not really. You know the doe, the cursed creature you saved. But me? Lyra Starweaver, daughter of House Starweaver, former lady-in-waiting to the queen. You don't know her. She might be someone you don't even like." "Then let me get to know her," Elarion said. "Let me learn who you are without the curse. Let me prove that what I feel isn't just residual magic or hero worship or whatever you think it is. And if you discover you don't like who I am, if I discover I don't like who you are without the danger binding us together, then at least we'll know," Elarion said. "At least we'll have tried." Isn't that better than walking away and spending the rest of our lives wondering? Lyra looked at him for a long moment, and he saw the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to believe him, wanted to take the chance, but fear held her back. Fear that what they'd had was just an illusion, that reality would disappoint them both. "I don't want to hurt you," she said finally, "and I don't want to be hurt. We've both been through enough." "Then we'll be careful," Elarion said. "We'll take it slow. No expectations, no pressure, just time. Time to figure out who we are to each other without magic or curses or hunters chasing us." "Time," Lyra repeated, as if testing the word. "I suppose we have that now, don't we? For the first time in 4 years, I have time." "So do I," Elarion said. "For the first time in 73 years, I have something worth spending time on." She laughed, a real laugh, bright and genuine, and the sound filled the small hut with warmth. "You're very persistent, Ranger." "It's one of my few virtues," he said with a smile. Lyra was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, time. We'll give ourselves time. But Elarion," she met his eyes seriously, "I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person who was cursed 4 years ago. I'm not even the same person who was the White Doe. I'm someone new, someone I'm still figuring out, and that person might not be who you expect or want." "I know," Elarion said. "I'm not the same person either. We'll figure out who we are together, or separately, if that's what we discover we need. But we'll figure it out honestly." "Honestly," she agreed, and extended her hand across the fire. He took it, and the touch sent a jolt through him. Not magic, just the simple electricity of skin on skin, of connection freely chosen. Her hand was warm and strong, and it fit in his like it had always belonged there. They held hands across the fire, 2 people who'd been through hell together and come out the other side changed but alive. The bond was gone, but something else remained, something fragile and new and entirely their own. Outside, the wind howled around the hut, but inside, they were warm. They talked through the night, really talked, sharing stories of their lives before the curse, their hopes and fears and dreams, learning each other not as Ranger and Cursed Doe, not as Savior and Saved, but as 2 people with their own histories and hurts and hopes. And slowly, carefully, they began to build something new. Not a bond forged by magic, but a connection chosen freely. It was harder this way, more uncertain, more vulnerable, but it was real, and real, they were both learning, was worth the risk. Dawn came softly to the mountain, the sun rising over distant peaks and painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Elarion woke first, as was his habit, and lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds of morning, the wind against the hut's walls, the crackling of embers in the fireplace, and Lyra's steady breathing from across the room. She'd insisted on sleeping separately, maintaining a careful distance as they navigated this new reality. He'd agreed without argument, understanding the need for boundaries, for space to figure things out without the pressure of proximity. But now, watching her sleep in the growing light, he felt a pang of longing so intense it took his breath away. Not for the bond, that was gone, and he was beginning to accept its loss, but for her, for the chance to know her, to be known by her, to build something real and lasting. As if sensing his gaze, Lyra's eyes opened. For a moment, she looked disoriented, as if expecting to wake as a doe in a forest clearing. Then memory returned, and her expression shifted. Wonder and sorrow and hope all mingled together. "Good morning," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. "Good morning," Elarion replied. "How do you feel?" She sat up slowly, testing her body, moving her arms and legs experimentally. Strange, everything feels different, lighter, taller, more articulated. She flexed her fingers, watching them with fascination. I'd forgotten what it was like to have hands, to be able to grasp things, to gesture, to touch with intention. She stood, and though she still moved with some uncertainty, she was steadier than the night before. She walked to the small window and looked out at the mountains, her silhouette backlit by the rising sun. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I saw this view as a doe, but seeing it with elven eyes, it's like seeing it for the first time." Elarion joined her at the window, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "The world looks different when you're not running for your life through it." "Yes," she agreed, then turned to look at him. "Elarion, about last night, what we talked about, did you mean it? About taking time, about getting to know each other?" "Every word," he said. She studied his face, as if trying to read the truth there. "It won't be easy. I'm not easy. I'm stubborn and opinionated, and I've spent 4 years unable to speak, so now that I can, I probably won't shut up. I have a temper, and I hold grudges, and I'm terrible at admitting when I'm wrong. I'm solitary and set in my ways," Elarion countered. "I talk to myself because I've lived alone for so long. I'm overprotective, and I have a tendency to brood. I'm not good with people or social situations, and I have no idea how to navigate whatever this is between us." "So we're both disasters," Lyra said, and there was a hint of humor in her voice. "Spectacular disasters," Elarion agreed. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't need to be perfect. Maybe we just need to be honest." Lyra was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Honest. I can do honest." She took a breath. "Then honestly, I'm terrified. I'm terrified that what we had was just the bond, just the circumstances. I'm terrified that in the light of day, without danger forcing us together, we'll discover we have nothing in common. I'm terrified of losing you, but I'm equally terrified of holding on to something that isn't real." "I'm terrified too," Elarion admitted. "I'm terrified that I'm not enough, that without the journey and the danger, I'm just a boring ranger with nothing to offer. I'm terrified that you'll realize you deserve better, someone from your world, someone who understands nobility and courts and all the things I've spent my life avoiding." They looked at each other, two people stripped of pretense and magic, standing in their fear and uncertainty. Then Lyra laughed, a real, genuine laugh that lit up her whole face. "We're quite a pair, aren't we? Both so afraid of the same thing." "What thing?" Elarion asked. "That we're not worthy of being loved," she said simply. "You think you're not enough. I think I'm too much. But maybe—" She stepped closer, closing some of the distance between them. "Maybe we're exactly what each other needs. Not despite our flaws, but because of them." Elarion felt something in his chest loosen, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "So what do we do? Where do we go from here?" Lyra looked out the window again, at the mountains stretching endlessly in every direction. "I don't know. I can't go back to my old life. I'm not that person anymore. But I don't know who I am now or where I belong." "Neither do I," Elarion said. "The cabin feels like a prison now, but I don't know what else there is." They stood in silence, contemplating the vast uncertainty of their futures. Then Lyra spoke, her voice tentative but growing stronger. "What if we didn't decide right now? What if we just started walking and saw where we ended up?" "Walking where?" "Anywhere. Everywhere." She turned to face him, and her eyes were bright with possibility. "You promised me once that when the curse was broken, you'd take me to the Festival of Stars. Do you remember?" "I remember," Elarion said softly. "Then let's start there. Let's go to the festival, and then maybe we visit that grove of singing trees you told me about, and the sacred spring where you harvested the salt, and all the other places you've seen in your 73 years. Show me the world, Elarion. The real world, not the one I saw while running for my life. And then, he asked, and then I'll show you my world, the cities and courts and libraries, the places I loved before the curse, the places I dreamed about while I was trapped. We'll explore together, and somewhere along the way, maybe we'll figure out who we are, separately and together. Elarion felt hope kindle in his chest, warm and bright. That could take years. I have years, Lyra said. For the first time in a long time, I have nothing but years stretching ahead of me, and I can't think of anyone I'd rather spend them with than the ranger who saved me. I didn't save you, Elarion said. We saved each other. Then let's keep doing that, Lyra said, and extended her hand. Partners in exploration and discovery and figuring out this mess we've gotten ourselves into? Elarion took her hand, and this time the touch felt different. Not less powerful than when they'd had the bond, but more real, more chosen, more theirs. Partners, he agreed. They left the hut as the sun climbed higher, warming the air and making the snow sparkle like diamonds. The descent from the mountain was slow but steady, Lyra growing more confident with each step, her body remembering how to be elven. They talked as they walked, about everything and nothing. Lyra told him about her childhood in the crystal towers of Silvermere, about her mother who'd been a scholar and her father who'd been a general, about the pressure to be perfect, to represent the family with grace and dignity, to never show weakness or doubt. I was good at it, she said. Too good. I played the role so well that I forgot it was a role. I forgot who I was underneath all the expectations. The curse, in a terrible way, freed me from that, forced me to be nothing but myself, with no performance, no pretense. Elarion told her about his father's death, about the weight of being the hero's son, about the slow retreat into isolation that had felt like safety, but was really just another kind of death. I thought I was protecting myself, he said, keeping my heart safe by keeping everyone at a distance. But all I was doing was making my world smaller and smaller, until there was nothing left but me and the trees and the silence. And then a stubborn doe showed up and ruined everything, Lyra said with a smile. Best ruination of my life, Elarion replied. They reached the base of the mountain by late afternoon, emerging from the foothills into the forest proper. The Frostwood stretched before them, vast and beautiful and no longer threatening. The hunters were gone, dead, fled, or simply giving up on prey that had proven too costly to pursue. Which way to the Festival of Stars? Lyra asked. Elarion oriented himself, checking the sun's position. Southeast, about a week's travel if we take our time. The festival doesn't start for another 2 weeks, so we're not in a hurry. Good, Lyra said. I want to take our time. I want to see everything. They walked southeast, and the forest opened before them like a gift. Elarion showed Lyra things he'd seen 1,000 times, but now saw anew through her eyes. The way ice crystals formed on spider webs, creating jeweled nets, the tracks of a fox family, the kits playing in the snow, a frozen waterfall that caught the light and threw rainbows across the clearing. Lyra was endlessly curious, asking questions about everything, touching bark and snow and ice with the wonder of someone experiencing the world fresh, and Elarion found himself seeing his forest, the place he'd known so intimately for so long, as if for the first time. That night, they made camp in a small clearing. Elarion built a fire and prepared dinner while Lyra gathered wood. The simple domestic tasks feeling comfortable and right, they ate and talked and watched the stars emerge. and when it was time to sleep, Lyra spread her bedroll close to his, not touching, but close enough that they could hear each other breathing. "Elarion?" she said into the darkness. "Yes? Thank you for everything, for saving me, for believing in me, for giving me the space to figure out who I am." "Thank you," he replied, "for the same things, for saving me from myself, for showing me that isolation isn't safety, it's just slow death, for being brave enough to take a chance on this." "We're taking a chance on each other," Lyra corrected. "That's what makes it worth it." They fell silent, and Elarion lay awake for a long time, listening to the forest sounds and Lyra's breathing and feeling something he hadn't felt in decades: contentment. Not the false contentment of isolation, but the real thing, the satisfaction of being exactly where you're supposed to be, with exactly who you're supposed to be with. The bond was gone, but what remained was better. It was choice. It was freedom. It was the possibility of love earned rather than magically granted. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. They walked during the day, exploring the forest, with Elarion teaching Lyra the ranger's skills: how to read tracks, how to move silently, how to find water and shelter. She was an eager student, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. In the evenings, Lyra would practice her magic. The curse had suppressed her abilities, but now they were returning, stronger than before. She could call light to her hands, could sense the magic in living things, could even communicate with animals in a limited way. "It's like learning to use a limb that was asleep," she explained one night, watching silver light dance between her fingers. "The power was always there, but I couldn't access it. Now it's flooding back, and I have to relearn control." "You're star-touched," Elarion said. "The dragon called you that. What does it mean?" Lyra's expression grew distant. "It's rare. Maybe 1 in 1,000 elves are born under the celestial conjunction, when all 3 moons align with certain stars. We're supposed to have a connection to the old magic, the wild magic that existed before the civilized races tried to codify and control it." She closed her fist and the light winked out. "My family saw it as a gift, a sign of prestige, but it always felt more like a burden. Everyone expected me to be special, to do great things. I just wanted to be normal." "You're not normal," Elarion said, "but that's not a bad thing. Normal is overrated." She laughed. "Says the elf who spent 73 years trying to be as normal and unremarkable as possible." "Touché," he admitted. As they traveled, they began to notice small changes in each other. Lyra grew stronger, more confident, her movements becoming fluid and sure. The haunted look that had lingered in her eyes began to fade, replaced by curiosity and joy. She smiled more, laughed more, seemed to expand into the space her freedom had created. Elarion found himself opening up in ways he hadn't in decades. He talked more, shared more, allowed himself to be vulnerable in Lyra's presence. The walls he'd built around his heart were coming down, brick by brick, and while it was terrifying, it was also liberating. And slowly, carefully, they grew closer. Not in the desperate, intense way of their journey, but in small, quiet moments. A hand offered to help over a difficult patch of trail, a shared joke that made them both laugh. The comfortable silence of 2 people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. One evening, about a week into their journey, they sat by the fire after dinner, and Lyra said, "I think I'm falling in love with you." Elarion's heart stopped. "You think?" "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I don't know if what I'm feeling is love or just gratitude or residual attachment from the bond. But whatever it is, it's growing. Every day I find myself wanting to be near you more, wanting to share things with you, wanting to know what you think about everything." She looked at him, Is that love? Or is it something else? I don't know, Elarion said honestly. I think I'm falling in love with you too, but I have the same doubts. Is it real or is it just habit? Is it love or is it just the comfort of familiarity? They sat with that uncertainty, not trying to resolve it, just acknowledging it. Maybe, Lyra said finally, we don't need to know right now. Maybe it's enough to just feel what we feel and see where it leads. Maybe, Elarion agreed. That night, for the first time, Lyra fell asleep with her head on his shoulder. It was a small thing, barely worth noting, but to Elarion it felt monumental. It was trust. It was choice. It was a step forward into the unknown. They reached the village where the Festival of Stars was held on a crisp autumn evening. The trees had turned gold and red, and the air smelled of wood smoke and spiced cider. Lanterns hung from every building, and music drifted through the streets, flutes and harps and drums that made your feet want to dance. Lyra stopped at the village edge, her eyes wide with wonder. It's beautiful, she breathed. Wait until you see the lanterns rise, Elarion said. That's when it becomes magical. They found an inn and rented a room, one room with 2 beds, a compromise between their growing closeness and their need for boundaries. They cleaned up, changed into fresh clothes, purchased from a village merchant, and ventured out into the festival. It was everything Elarion had promised and more. The streets were packed with people, elves and humans and even a few dwarves, all celebrating together. Food vendors sold roasted nuts and honey cakes and mulled wine. Musicians played on every corner. Children ran through the crowds, laughing and shrieking with joy. And everywhere there were lanterns, hundreds of them, thousands, each one carrying a wish or a prayer or a hope. Lyra moved through the festival like a child, her face alight with wonder. She tried every food, listened to every musician, watched every performance, and Elarion followed, content to see the world through her eyes, to experience her joy as if it were his own. As night fell, the moment arrived. The crowd gathered in the central square, each person holding a lantern. An elder elf stood on a platform and spoke about the meaning of the festival, about hope and renewal, about letting go of the past and embracing the future, about the light we carry within us even in the darkest times. Then, on a signal, everyone released their lanterns. They rose into the sky like a river of light, hundreds of glowing orbs ascending into the darkness. They climbed higher and higher, until the sky itself seemed to be full of stars, and it was impossible to tell where the lanterns ended and the real stars began. Lyra gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling, the biggest, most genuine smile Elarion had ever seen. "It's perfect," she whispered. "It's absolutely perfect." Elarion had purchased 2 lanterns earlier. He handed one to Lyra. "Make a wish," he said. She took the lantern, cradling it gently. "What did you wish for?" "If I tell you, it won't come true," he said with a smile. "That's not how it works," Lyra said. "The wishes are meant to be spoken aloud. That's how they gain power." "All right then," Elarion said. He looked at his lantern, then at Lyra. "I wish for the courage to keep choosing love, even when it's scary, even when I don't know if it will work out. I wish for the strength to be vulnerable, to let someone in, to risk being hurt because the alternative, staying closed off and safe, is worse than any pain." Lyra's eyes glistened with fresh tears. "That's a good wish." "What about you?" Elarion asked. "What do you wish for?" Lyra looked at her lantern, then up at the sky full of light. "I wish for the wisdom to know the difference between the cage I was born into and the life I choose." I wish for the freedom to become whoever I'm meant to be, without fear or apology. And I wish, she looked at Elarion, I wish for the chance to build something real with someone who sees me, really sees me, not the lady or the cursed doe, but me. I see you, Elarion said softly. I've always seen you. I know, Lyra said. That's why I'm here. Together, they released their lanterns. The glowing orbs rose into the sky, joining the river of light, carrying their wishes up to the stars. They watched until their lanterns were indistinguishable from all the others, until the sky was so full of light it seemed like day. Then Lyra took Elarion's hand. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. It was choice. It was trust. It was a step forward into an uncertain future, taken together. Dance with me, she said. I'm not a good dancer, Elarion warned. Neither am I, Lyra said. I spent 4 years with hooves, but I want to try. I want to dance at the Festival of Stars with the ranger who kept his promise. So they danced. They were terrible at it, stumbling over each other's feet, moving out of sync with the music, laughing at their own clumsiness. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were there, together, choosing each other in a moment that wasn't born of desperation or danger, but of simple, genuine desire. As they spun through the crowded square, Lyra's hand in his, her laughter in his ears, Elarion felt something click into place. This was it. This was what he'd been missing for 73 years. Not solitude or safety, but connection. Not isolation, but belonging. The bond was gone, but what had grown in its place was better. It was real. It was chosen. It was theirs. The music played on, and they danced until their feet hurt, and they couldn't stop laughing. They danced until the lanterns had all risen out of sight, and the stars were the only lights in the sky. They danced until the festival began to wind down, and people started drifting home. Finally, breathless and happy, they stopped. They stood in the middle of the square, holding hands, looking at each other in the starlight. I love you, Lyra said. Not, I think I love you, or I might love you, but a simple statement of fact. I don't know if it's the same as what we had before. It feels different, quieter maybe, but deeper, more real. But it's love. I'm sure of that now. I love you too, Elarion said. I've loved you since the moment I saw you in that trap. I loved you as a doe, and I love you as yourself, and I'll love you tomorrow and the day after, and every day we have together. That's a long time, Lyra said. Not long enough, Elarion replied. She smiled, and in that smile he saw their future. Uncertain, yes, but full of possibility. They would explore the world together. They would learn and grow and change. They would fight and make up, and figure out how to build a life that honored both their needs. It wouldn't always be easy, but it would be real, and real was worth everything. Lyra leaned in and Elarion met her halfway. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of honey cakes and hope, of new beginnings and chosen futures. When they pulled apart, they were both smiling. So, Lyra said, what do we do now? Now, Elarion said, we keep walking. We see where the path leads, together. Together, Lyra agreed. They left the square hand in hand, walking through the village streets as the festival wound down around them. Above, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, and somewhere among them 2 lanterns carried their wishes into the infinite. The ranger and the White Doe, no, the ranger and the star-touched elf, had found their way to each other. Not through magic or fate, but through choice, through courage, through love freely given and freely received. Their story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. And the best part? They would write it together, one step, one day, one choice at a time. The path ahead was uncertain, but they would walk it side by side, and that, they both knew, was all that mattered. The end.